Act 1. Scene 1. An interview room. A table. On opposite sides of the table are Jay and Mrs. Reynolds. Jay is in his late teens, he's a bit nervy, on edge, but with a ready smile. Mrs. Reynolds is late 50s, early 60s, and harassed. At the head of the table is Cassie, a bright young professional woman in her 20s. Some distance away, a WPC. Cassie takes up her notes. Cassie J, you acknowledge that. Reading briskly. Mrs. Reynolds had put many hours' work into her garden, all of which was lost as a result of your actions. J, interrupting. Yes, I acknowledge that. Cassie, I'll just read it all. And you can say yes or no at the end. J, oh, okay. Cassie continues to read, Jay greeting each point with a nod, or a yeah, but not breaking into her speech. Cassie Mrs. Reynolds felt insecure in her own home, never knowing when it might be attacked again. You acknowledge this was the result of your actions. And while having her house broken into was a traumatic experience for Mrs. Reynolds. It was the destruction of her garden. An act of deliberate and purposeless vandalism, which caused Mrs. Reynolds most distress. You acknowledge that this was the result of your actions. She looks up from the paper. Do you agree to all that? Jay, yeah, no problem. Cassie Mrs. Reynolds, you've said. Reading again. That as a result of meeting Jay, you feel less threatened and vulnerable. Mrs. Reynolds, not threatened at all by that little ruffian. Jay, jovial, not vicious. Ruffian. Where'd you get her? Antiques Roadshow. Cassie, reading again. Understanding that the incident was random, not specifically targeted, has left you feeling much less victimized. She looks up. Mrs. Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds, hello. Cassie, understanding the incident was random and not specifically targeted at you has left you feeling much less victimized. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, all right. Cassie, back to the document. In order to rectify the situation, first, Jay will formally apologize to Mrs. Reynolds for the damage done. Second, Jay will undertake community payback. Mrs. Reynolds, sorry, community payback. Cassie, it's what they used to call community service, but then they decided doing service to the community sounds like it might have some sort of dignity about it. So they changed it to community punishment. But then if it's just a punishment, what is the community getting out of it? So now they've gone for community payback. Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Right, okay. Cassie J will undertake community payback. He will make himself available at a time convenient to Mrs. Reynolds. And he will do such work around her garden as she specifies. She looks up from the paper. Cassie, okay, so do we all agree what I read accurately represents the outcome of this meeting? Mrs. Reynolds, a fairly sanitized version, yes. Cassie J. J, totally, yeah. Cassie, great stuff. To the WPC, Debbie, if you wouldn't mind. The WPC goes off. Debbie will sort us out some tea and biscuits, which I think we've all earned. I'll pop next door, run off a couple of copies and then we can sign. She leaves. A moment. And then Jay looks up and beams at Mrs. Reynolds. His demeanor has completely changed. He's swaggering, sprawling, full of attitude and himself. He gets out a lighter and a pack of cigarettes. Mrs. Reynolds, I doubt you're allowed to smoke in here. Jay looks round. Jay, I'm not seeing any signs. Jay lights up. Jay, glad to hear you're feeling less victimized now. Cause of the mimicking Cassie. Random nature of the incident. Mrs. Reynolds, of his cigarette. Each one of those is 10 minutes off your life. Jay, pity it wasn't. Mrs. Reynolds, sorry. Jay, I walk along your street every other day. I see you, in your garden. You always look so pleased with yourself. It wasn't random. I did it on purpose. And you should feel victimized. Because you are a victim. Cassie pops her head in. Cassie, everything all right? Jay, just having a lovely little chat. About gardening. Cassie, won't be a sec. Cassie is gone. Jay, and if you repeat a word of what I just said, and I get put away, well, that would not be too clever. Mrs. Reynolds, you little sod. Jay, you be careful what you say now, 'cause I'm a lot of fun. I'm a fun kind of guy, but about this I am deadly serious. I got people. I got a strong support system. I know. You're fired up now and you want to have a go at me, but don't bother. Just suck it up. Sign the paper, say you are happy. Because if you don't. Cassie returns. Cassie can't smoke in here. Jay, sorry. You should put up some signs. Scene 2. The front garden of Mrs. Reynolds' house. Jay is lounging around, finishing a packet of crisps. He flattens the packet, tips the crumbs directly into his mouth. Then he scrunches the packet up, tosses it away. Mrs. Reynolds emerges with a mug of tea. Jay, what, no tea for the worker? Mrs. Reynolds, haven't seen you lift a finger. Jay, maybe you need your eyes fixing. Mrs. Reynolds, if you think you can just loaf about, you've got another think coming. Jay, nah. I haven't. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm not frightened of you. Jay, yeah, you are. You're terrified. Mrs. Reynolds, I know you think you're this ruffian. Jay, I'm starting to really like that. Ruffian. Echoing the Justin Timberlake song. I'm bringing ruffian back. Mrs. Reynolds, if I make you some tea, then will you think about doing some work? Jay, beat. Milk and 3 sugars, please. Mrs. Reynolds moves off. Jay relaxes in the garden. Sings a snatch of an incredibly offensive, or insufferably irritating song. Something like the charming, I Wanna Fuck You by Akon. But he can sing a bleeped version, so he puts in a bleep where there should be an F word. Mrs. Reynolds returns with a mug of tea. Mrs. Reynolds, forced cheer. There you go. Jay takes a sip. Jay, you trying to poison me? Mrs. Reynolds, you said, milk and 3 sugars. Jay, in my coffee. I never drink tea. Mrs. Reynolds, you said to me, tea for the worker. Jay, the eyes aren't the only thing on the way out. Your memory's going, love. Mrs. Reynolds, I know what I heard. Jay, when I was 5 a tea bag burst and I swallowed a whole load of tea leaves and nearly choked to death. Since that day I've never touched tea in my life. I know I'm not your favorite boy in the whole wide world, but using my childhood traumas to get to me. That is cold, Mrs. R. He tips the tea away into the flower beds. Mrs. Reynolds, you said you'd do some work if you got some tea, so now let's see. Jay, no, you asked me to think about doing some work. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, for goodness sake. Jay, and I'm still thinking. I'm thinking that there's something you forgot. Mrs. Reynolds, what? Jay, a tiny little word that gets you what you want. Mrs. Reynolds, I haven't got a clue what you're wittering on about. Jay, please. Mrs. Reynolds, will you get to work on my garden as you promised you would? Please. Jay, wasn't so hard, was it? Where do you want me to start? Mrs. Reynolds, just do some weeding in those beds. Jay, you're the boss. Jay offers her his empty mug. Mrs. Reynolds takes it, heads off. Jay takes a look at the beds. Puts on some gardening gloves. Then walks up to a rose bush, grabs it by its lowest stems, just above the ground, and heaves away at it. Mrs. Reynolds, what the bloody hell are you doing? Jay, oi. Language. Mind my delicate ears. Mrs. Reynolds, that's a rose bush you're pulling up. Jay, is it? Mrs. Reynolds, you'll torn half the roots. Jay, so weeding's not my thing. Mrs. Reynolds, you'll killed it. Jay, just doing what you told me. Mrs. Reynolds, this is a joke to you, isn't it? Jay considers, solemn. Then smiles. Jay, pretty much, yeah. Cassie enters. Cassie, hello all, sorry I'm late. Target's meeting at HQ. There are targets, we're missing them. How are you two getting on? Jay, yeah, we're good. Cassie, Mrs. Reynolds, happy. Happier. Mrs. Reynolds, has hardly put it back like it was. Cassie, I think one of the things we established was that the damage Jay did was irreparable, in terms of your time, and your care for your garden, and so he's not going to be able to put that back. Is he? Mrs. Reynolds, well no. Cassie, I mean, by definition. J. Try to keep up, Mrs. R. Cassie, what we're doing here today, it is practical I hope, but it's a recognition that there's a debt to be paid and that J is willing to pay it. Beat? And do you feel he has? Mrs. Reynolds, sorry. Cassie, do you feel J has recognized he owes you a debt? A look between J and Mrs. Reynolds. J, take your time, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, shall I put the kettle on? Cassie, beat. Okay, yeah, do that. Have a little think about what I've said. And I'll have a chat to J. Mrs. Reynolds goes inside. Cassie, so how's it been? Not strained yourself? J, sorry. Cassie, by working too hard? J, not really, no. Cassie, no, thought not. J, do you know what? He's looking at Cassie. That's really interesting. Cassie, what is? He turns away, picks a flower and gives it a sniff. J, that's nice, that is. Smells like air freshener. Cassie, what's really interesting, J? J, she. Cassie, Mrs. Reynolds. J, well, obviously, yeah. He stops, blinks. Cassie, what? J, it's gone all up my nose. He sneezes. Cassie produces a packet of tissues. J takes one. J cheers. He blows his nose. Inspects the tissue. Then throws it away. Cassie, J. J, what? Cassie gingerly picks up the scrunched up tissue and finds somewhere to put it. J, Grandma Reynolds, round you she's like a mouse. Why is that? Cassie, we all relate to different people in different ways. J, and some people we don't relate to at all. Mrs. Reynolds brings out 3 teacups on a tray. Cassie, Mrs. Reynolds, I'd like to chat to you about. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, and biscuits. I meant to bring a biscuits. Cassie, I don't know if we'll have time for biscuits. Mrs. Reynolds, they're just in the kitchen, won't take 2 seconds. And Mrs. Reynolds goes in again. Cassie, okay, I'll come with. Cassie follows her. J gets up, fetches himself a cup of tea from the tray, then sits back down where he was. He sips from the tea, then puts the cup down. He gets up, walks back over to the tray, leans down, and dribbles spit into each of the 2 remaining cups. Then goes back to where he was, sits back down, and resumes drinking his own tea. Grinning broadly now. Mrs. Reynolds comes back out, carrying a plate of biscuits, Cassie at her heel. Cassie, but there have been some positives from this morning. Mrs. Reynolds, I suppose, while he's here he's not causing mischief elsewhere. She puts down the biscuits. Help yourself. J, I always do. J takes 2 or 3 biscuits. One of them is a custard cream, and he sets to work demolishing it by stages, nibbling off 1/2 of the biscuit, then licking up the cream filling. Cassie, so do you think we can say? J, how's your tea, Cass? Cassie, it's fine. J makes a lovely cup of tea, doesn't she, our Mrs. R? Cassie, usually I'm a slave to the charms of the double-shot latte, but this really is hitting the spot, thanks. Mrs. Reynolds, just tea bags, milk and water, it's hardly rocket science. Cassie, as I was saying, the point of this morning was for J to go some way towards rectifying the situation. How do we feel that's gone? J, brilliant. Couldn't EVE gone better? Cassie and Mrs. Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds, well, She breaks off, lifts the cup to her mouth. J is watching carefully. Then without taking a sip she continues speaking. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't know if his heart's really in it. J, oh, that's harsh, Mrs. R. Cassie, and what makes you say that? Mrs. Reynolds, just a feeling. Cassie, and what gives you that feeling? Mrs. Reynolds, the way he behaves. Cassie, what sort of behavior, specifically, gives you the feeling J's heart isn't in it? Mrs. Reynolds, and not just what he does. What he says as well. Cassie, what sorts of things does he say, Mrs. Reynolds? J, yes, Mrs. R, what have I said? Cassie, specifically. J, be specific, Mrs. R, cause you're really upsetting me now. I'm really hurt. Mrs. Reynolds, well, I don't know. Again she lifts the cup to her mouth. Again J is on tenterhooks. And again she doesn't drink. Mrs. Reynolds, his attitude. Cassie, sometimes attitudes are difficult to judge. Say when people come from different backgrounds to us, sometimes we can misinterpret the signals that are being given off. Do you think that's what might have happened today? Possibly. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't know. J, you don't want to misinterpret me, Mrs. R. Cassie, J, shut up. To Mrs. Reynolds, I have a sense there are things you're not saying. Mrs. Reynolds, well, She lifts the cup to her mouth. J on tenterhooks again. Mrs. Reynolds stops. Looks into the cup. Looks up at J. She throws the tea towards the root of the rosebush. Mrs. Reynolds, it just seems, last Christmas kids came along and painted, graffitied. Cassie, yes, I know. Mrs. Reynolds, the whole street. Every house along this side. And the council wrote to us. Said the appearance of our houses was detrimental to the area. Said we had to clear it up, or else. Cassie, well, that's horrible. Mrs. Reynolds, cost me 150 quid to get a man. And cars get smashed up, or stolen, all the time. Sheila, down the road's given up having one now. Doesn't bother. Too much hassle. Do you see? If you live in this street, you can't even have a car. Cause, at J, they won't let you. If we were rich, someone would stop it. But and now he waltzes along here for an hour and he's just let off. Cassie, I understand your frustration, and I don't know what went wrong with the graffiti incident. That just sounds like a horrible, horrible mistake somewhere, but that was nothing to do with Jay. And we're here to deal with what Jay did to your garden. So do you feel Jay hasn't done enough? He could come back another day and do more. But would you want him to come back? Jay, I could come back, Mrs. R. With some friends maybe. Do a proper job. Mrs. Reynolds, no, I don't want that. Jay, no, I thought not. Cassie, so we'll say you're content. Mrs. Reynolds doesn't answer. Cassie, everything I've learned, everything I've seen in this job tells me, if Jay goes to prison, it will not help. He'll come out worse. At this, Mrs. Reynolds seems to soften a little. But then. Jay, imagine that. Imagine me, but worse. Cassie, and it's a real pity your flower displays will be a bit depleted this summer, but there's always next year. Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Yes, of course. Mrs. Reynolds looks out over what remains of her garden, it's just a tiny moment. Mrs. Reynolds, you're right. He's turned up, he's done his best. I'm satisfied. Cassie, I'm really pleased to hear that. Jay, I am too, Mrs. R, pleased and relieved. For the both of us. Cassie, some people find they want to shake hands at this point. Mrs. Reynolds, do they? Cassie, you might find it helps you reach a point of closure. Jay, I'll shake. No problem. Jay extends his hand. Cassie, the courts take it as quite a big symbolic thing, if the victim and offender shake hands. Mrs. Reynolds, say we did then. Cassie, you're perfectly free not to shake hands with Jay. If that's how you want the record to stand. Jay, is that how you want the record to stand, Mrs. R? Mrs. Reynolds steps towards Jay, takes his hand. They shake. Jay, nice, we can part as friends. Jay holds the handshake for longer than Mrs. Reynolds wants to. She slightly snatches her hand away from him. Mrs. Reynolds, I'll get your coat. Mrs. Reynolds leaves, quickly. Cassie is watching Jay. Jay, what? Cassie, just. Jay, just, what? Cassie, don't make me regret, you know. Jay, regret what? Cassie, she could have gone either way. Mrs. Reynolds returns with Jay's jacket. Mrs. Reynolds, here you go. Cassie, what I can do, Mrs. Reynolds, is give you the number of victim support. They might be able to offer you counseling in relation to the various offenses you were talking about. Mrs. Reynolds holds the jacket out so Jay can put it on. Jay, very kind. Jay goes to put the jacket on. As he does so, something falls out. Cassie, think you dropped something there. Cassie bends and picks up a pearl necklace. She holds it for a moment. Mrs. Reynolds, my pearls. How did they get in your coat? Jay, not a clue. Mrs. Reynolds, you tell me to give him a chance. So I give him a chance. I let him into my home and the little thug steals from me. Cassie, I don't know what to say. Jay, Cassie's speechlessness. Every cloud, eh? Mrs. Reynolds, this was a present, from my husband. Jay, I don't know how it got there, all right. Mrs. Reynolds, our 30th anniversary. Jay, how stupid do you think I am? Anything goes missing while I'm here. Then I'm in the frame. Mrs. Reynolds, sounds like you've given it some thought. Jay, it's obvious. Cassie, were you wearing it today? Could it be fallen from your neck? Mrs. Reynolds, to Cassie. He's got you believing him already. Cassie, I just want to make sure of every possibility. Mrs. Reynolds, I can't remember the last time I wore it. It's worth money. He's been into my bedroom, gone through my things. Jay, I haven't even been in your house. Mrs. Reynolds, you have, you went to the toilet. Jay, okay, yeah, but apart from that. Mrs. Reynolds, I remember thinking you were taking your time. Jay, what was I supposed to do, piss in a bottle? Mrs. Reynolds, you see, he lies at every step. Jay, I forgot about that, all right. Mrs. Reynolds, you look me in the eye and you swear you didn't steal from me. Jay, I swear. He hesitates, struggles, cannot help but break into a smile. Jay, I'm sorry. Mrs. Reynolds, he can't do it. He can't look me in the eye. Jay, it's just you're being so deadly serious and over nothing. Cassie, Jay, this is not nothing. This is a really serious abuse of trust. Jay, let me guess, you're not angry. You're just really disappointed. Cassie, actually it's exactly the opposite. I'm bloody furious. Cassie gets out her phone. Jay, what are you doing? Cassie, I'm calling the police. Jay, you're turning me in. Cassie shrugs. Jay, is that it? You're just shrugging at me. Cassie should have thought of that before. Jay, this is a setup. Cassie, on phone. Yes, hello, I'd like to report a crime. Beat? No, it's not an emergency. Beat? Yes, I'll hold. Mrs. Reynolds, what will happen when the police come? Cassie, I don't think his application for bail will be looked on too kindly this time. Mrs. Reynolds, he'll go to jail. Cassie, he'll be on remand. Mrs. Reynolds, but locked up. Cassie, oh yes. Jay, to Mrs. Reynolds. You are loving this, aren't you? Mrs. Reynolds, loving that you came into my house and stole from me. No, I don't think so. Cassie, on phone. Yes, I'm still holding. Jay, I didn't steal from you. Mrs. Reynolds, only because you got found out. To Cassie. Even now, and he won't admit what he's done. Jay, I hate to keep coming back to this boring, fact, but I didn't do it. Cassie, on the phone. Yes, hello. Hi. Yes, I'd like to report it. Yes, I'll hold. Mrs. Reynolds, if that's your attitude, then locked up is the best place for you. Jay, no, it's not, it's the worst place, I swear to God. Mrs. Reynolds, not so full of yourself now, are you? Jay, do you want me to lie and say I did it? Mrs. Reynolds, no. Jay, what then? Mrs. Reynolds, I want you to tell the truth. And say you did it. Cassie, to Mrs. Reynolds. They are sending a car now. Jay, all right. I admit it. Mrs. Reynolds reaches out to Cassie. Cassie, on phone. Would you mind holding for a second? Cassie lowers the phone, hand over its microphone. Mrs. Reynolds, tell us what you did. Jay, I snuck into your bedroom, I went through your jewelry, saw the necklace, thought, right, I'll have that. Mrs. Reynolds, then what? Jay, then I heard you coming. I slipped it in my jacket pocket. Mrs. Reynolds, that's the truth. Jay, beat. And nothing but. Mrs. Reynolds, Cassie, maybe we can sort this out between ourselves. Cassie, on phone. Hi. Actually, it's fine. False alarm. Sorry for wasting your time. She ends the call. Cassie, what exactly are you saying, Mrs. Reynolds? Mrs. Reynolds, the second he thinks he's really going to jail. He's terrified. We're making progress. Scene 3. A little way from Mrs. Reynolds' house, in a small paved area created to stop joyriders using the street as a rat run. There's a fairly big raised bed, into which a young tree was once planted. All that remains of it is a meter or so of thin trunk sticking up from the bed. To one side of the bed, a bench. Scrawled across it in white marker, is the legend, the Adeline Street Sherry Bench. Behind the bench, a brick wall. Long rusted barbed wire loops across its top, carrier bags caught on the barbs. Lots of graffiti on the wall. Prominent amongst it, certainly visible to the audience, is the legend Natil is a slag and a prostitute. Mrs. Reynolds arrives, carrying a couple of jute bags in one hand and a watering can in the other. Jay follows her. Mrs. Reynolds stops, puts down the bags and watering can. Looks round her and then expectantly to Jay. Jay, what? Mrs. Reynolds, look at this. Jay, what about it? Mrs. Reynolds, it's horrible, isn't it? Jay, dunno. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, it is horrible, Jay. You're just being your usual kind self in not saying so. What happened was, kids were stealing cars and tearing up and down the street, so they paved this bit off. Put in a bench. This little planer. Stuck a tree in it. Beat. The tree lasted 3 days. Look, you can see they snapped it off at the trunk. Must have taken quite an effort. Council haven't bothered to replace it, why would they? And the bench has now been christened, she reads. The Adeline Street Sherry Bench. Which is lovely. Jay, beat. And? Mrs. Reynolds, and I am sick of looking at this horribleness. We are going to make it beautiful. Or, I tell the police you tried to steal from me, and tonight you'll be sharing a landing with some very rough men indeed. Jay, this is so not fair. Mrs. Reynolds, it's so not what? Jay, forget it. Mrs. Reynolds, no, go on, say it again. I love it. I love hearing you complain about things being not fair. Jay stays silent. Mrs. Reynolds, no. Let's get to work, then. First we need to clean up a bit, well, I say we. From her bag she produces a folded up bin bag, and offers it to Jay. He takes it, goes over to the planter. Mrs. Reynolds, there's broken glass and general nastiness in there. She means the planter. You should probably have some gloves. Jay walks back to Mrs. Reynolds. She hesitates, enjoying the moment, then gets from her bag a pair of pink rubber washing up gloves. She holds them out to Jay. Jay, very funny, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, now you can start to wonder, did I happen to have pink rubber gloves in a man's size lying about the house? Or did I go out to buy some, just to make you wear them? What's your verdict? Jay looks at her. Mrs. Reynolds, little bit of the tough guy stare, but you're learning to keep your trap shut, which is a vast improvement. So snap on the marigolds, and step to it. Jay does as he is told. Mrs. Reynolds takes a small sheet of sandpaper from her bag, sits on the bench, and begins to sand away at some of the graffiti. Jay snaps on the gloves, starts picking up rubbish from the planter. After a very short, while only 30 or 40 seconds, Mrs. Reynolds has to stop sanding. She stretches her fingers to loosen them up, and tries again. It's no good. She switches hands. Jay, so we gonna be long? Mrs. Reynolds, will be as long as it takes. Jay, I've got a sign on. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm sorry. Jay, sign on. At the dole. Mrs. Reynolds, oh of course. Jay the gangster. Queuing up at the social, filling out his forms. Jay, so what? Mrs. Reynolds, you think you're some kind of outlaw. You couldn't survive 5 minutes without the law. Jay,'s alright. I'll tell I was late cause the old lady who's blackmailing me wouldn't let me come in on time. Mrs. Reynolds, you still said old lady, thought. Not old cow. Or old bitch. Which is obviously what you were thinking. Jay, can't stop what goes on in my head, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, I couldn't care less what nastiness goes on in your vile little head. I just don't want it to impinge on me, ever. And it looks like I'm getting my way. Jay gets back to picking up rubbish from the planter. Mrs. Reynolds sits, kneading her knuckles. Jay, all right, I'm finished. Mrs. Reynolds, wonderful. Jay, so can I go? Mrs. Reynolds, is this place beautiful? No, it is not. Can you go? What do you think? Mrs. Reynolds picks up one of her bags, and walks over to the planter. Mrs. Reynolds, I told Sheila down the road I was going to tidy up this bed, and she said she had a few spares. We have 2 Rudbeckia, 3 lobelia, and I don't actually know what those are, but beggars can't be choosers. She offers him a pot. Jay, where do I stick it? Quieter. Apart from up your ass. Mrs. Reynolds, what was that? J. Nothing, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds takes the pot back from him. Mrs. Reynolds, you don't stick anything. First you observe. We water the plant, thoroughly. We dig a little hole, removing non-organic debris and stones. We loosen the earth at the bottom of the hole. So it's easy for the roots to spread. We get the loose earth nice and wet. We lift the plant from its pot, it pops out. Thanks to having been watered so thoroughly. Just moments before. We loosen the root ball. We place the plant in the hole. We push the earth we dug out, back in. Then we tamp the earth down. Gently but firmly around the plant. J. Gently but firmly at the same time. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, that's right. J. Beat. Whatever. Mrs. Reynolds, as one might be gentle but firm with a lover, for example. J. Oh my gosh, I do not need to hear this. Mrs. Reynolds, do you think you can manage that? J. Whatever. J and Mrs. Reynolds both get to work planting, Mrs. Reynolds keeping an eye on J's progress. Mrs. Reynolds, don't forget to loosen the earth at the bottom of the hole. J. Yeah, I know. A moment of planting activity. Mrs. Reynolds, very nice woman, Sheila. J. looks at her. Mrs. Reynolds, who gave us the plants? J. Oh right. Mrs. Reynolds, a lesbian, I believe. Beat. A lot of it about these days, lesbianism. J. Hey, how can you tell a lesbian bar? Mrs. Reynolds, I don't want to know. J. Not even the pool tables got balls. Mrs. Reynolds, sometimes I wonder why that is. Why so many of the young women are lesbians these days. And then I look at a young man like you, and I think, well, it's no wonder at all, is it? J. doesn't rise to it. He just picks up another plant. Mrs. Reynolds inspects his work. Mrs. Reynolds, that last one's not bad, you know. See, it's standing up nice and straight. Done a good job there. J. Yeah, right. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm serious, look at the first one you did and then look at that last one. Can you see the difference? J. No. Mrs. Reynolds, you've learned how to plant something. J. couldn't give a toss. Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Fine. Off you go, then. Mrs. Reynolds turns away from him, begins packing up tools and plant pots. J. On the bus, I'm gonna make spitballs. Like bits of paper. That you chew up with spit. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, I know. J. I'm gonna pick someone. An old bloke. Or some fat woman. Some prick with big glasses and a haircut. I'm gonna sit behind them. I'm gonna chuck spitballs. At the back of their head. And one, they'll think it's just nothing. Then the second, the third. They'll know there's something going on. But still they'll sit there. They'll just take it. Because they always do. So I'll keep chucking them. Till finally they've got to turn round. And I'll throw a lovely ball of my flob. Right in the face of the fat bint. Or the old bloke. Or the poor mum with all her kiddies. And I will smile. And that smile will be for you, Mrs. R. And I'm gonna do that every day. I'm gonna pick on someone. Terrorize them. Every day you make me come here. Mrs. Reynolds, I hope they smack you in the mouth. J. They do, I'll get the law on them. Mrs. Reynolds, oh yes, the law, the hoodie's best friend. J. You're a player, you play the system. Course you could stop it, Mrs. R. You could save all those innocent people from being terrorized. If you just let me be on my way. Mrs. Reynolds, course if you just sat on the bus, minded your business. No one would even notice you existed. But you sprawl across the seats. Music blaring out your phone. Swearing and cursing and being foul. Everyone sees you then. Everyone notices. And that's what you want. You want people like me to even notice you exist. Well, I noticed. We all did. We were just ignoring you, hoping you would go away. But I know now you won't. And I can't ignore you anymore. Cause you have got to be stopped. Scene 4. Same as before, the planter, the wall covered in graffiti. But the flowers J planted have been ripped up. Their remains are scattered across the stage. Jay arrives first, carrying a watering can. He takes in the destruction. Anne is delighted. Jay, oh, yes. That is fantastic work. Mrs. Reynolds follows, carrying bags and a watering can. Jay, morning, Mrs. R. And how are you, this fine day? Mrs. Reynolds looks about her. Jay, now look. I am dying to get busy with the watering can, but what is there to water? Mrs. Reynolds, yes, I see your problem. Jay, so what? I'll be off then, shall I? There's nothing for me to do here. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay, do you think this is a disappointment for me? A shock? Jay, you made me plant the flowers. I'm guessing you wanted them to stay planted. Mrs. Reynolds, oh no, I knew some little thugs would tear them up. Jay, what was the point making me doing it then? Mrs. Reynolds, how does it feel, looking around? Jay, how does what now? Mrs. Reynolds, how does it feel, seeing your work ruined? Jay couldn't give a toss. Mrs. Reynolds, all your effort. Jay, yeah, I didn't put that much effort in though. Mrs. Reynolds, it doesn't bother you, that everything you've done has been spoiled. Jay, I never wanted to do it, why am I gonna get worked up about it? Mrs. Reynolds, fair point. Jay, so like, can I go? Mrs. Reynolds, afraid not, no. She gets from her bag a sunflower, a young plant, with no flowers as yet. Jay, oh, what is this? Mrs. Reynolds, this is a Russian giant. He looks at her, what the hell is that? Mrs. Reynolds, a sunflower. Spare from my garden. She offers the plant to him. Mrs. Reynolds, come on. You know the drill. Jay, but what's the point? Mrs. Reynolds, the point is that a bright and beautiful sunflower will cheer up everyone who passes. Jay, except it's gonna get pulled up. Just like the others. And you know this. You're just doing it to torment me. Mrs. Reynolds, not to torment you, no. Jay, and what then? When we come back tomorrow and this one is gone. Mrs. Reynolds, then we plant something else. Meaning the sunflower, put it close to the trunk, and then we can use that to give it support. Jay, yesterday, you had loads of plants. Today, we're down to one. That whole thing, just one flower in it. You're running out. Tonight they'll tear your Russian giant to bits, tomorrow you'll have nothing. They're gonna beat you. Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, that's right, Jay. We're trying to make things better, and the thugs and vandals are beating us. Jay, it's not me that's trying. It's you. I don't give a toss. Mrs. Reynolds, I know it's hard for you. You're young, and young people don't believe in change. Having not lived long enough. But believe you me, you will have people you care about. People you love, and the thought of anything happening to them. Jay, the ones I love, I protect with my life. Mrs. Reynolds, you can't be everywhere. You can't be there, all the time. Jay, I'll do my best. Mrs. Reynolds, you'll fail. Jay, I won't. Mrs. Reynolds, yes you will. We all do. Jay, not me. Mrs. Reynolds, all you can hope for is that the world is kind to the ones you love. Jay, not much chance of that. Mrs. Reynolds, and by being such a selfish, nasty, ignorant toe rag, you make the world a little bit less kind every day. The way you act will come back, not just on you, but on the ones you care about. Jay couldn't give a toss. Mrs. Reynolds, you will. Jay, but I don't. Mrs. Reynolds, but you will. Jay, so what? I don't care. What I will care about. I only care. What I care about now. And what I care about now. Mrs. Reynolds, is your own sweet self, and sod all else. Jay, Mrs. R, you're starting to get me. I love it. What a beautiful hands across the ocean moment. Mrs. Reynolds, all right. Jay, cheery. Sensing victory. You're giving up. I knew you would. Mrs. Reynolds, the sunflower. Plant that. I'll be back. Jay, whatever you say, Mrs. R. Jay gets to work planting the sunflower. Mrs. Reynolds heads off. Once she's gone, Jay sits on the bench, stretches. After a bit he hears Mrs. Reynolds returning. He jumps up and gets back to the planter. Mrs. Reynolds enter, carrying a big paintbrush and a tin of white masonry paint. Jay, nearly finished. She puts down the paint, goes over to the wall. Mrs. Reynolds. Natal is a slag, and a prostitute. Natalie spelled incorrectly, but prostitute spelled right. Jay can spell your name how you like. Mrs. Reynolds. You can doesn't make it right. Just means you've chosen to have your name spelled wrong, for the whole of your life. Jay says you. Mrs. Reynolds. Yes, I do. Mrs. Reynolds puts the paint and brush at his feet. Jay, you want me to paint over it? Mrs. Reynolds. You're going to paint the whole wall. Jay, what for? Mrs. Reynolds. I don't want to look at any of this, ever again. Jay, but there'll just be more graffiti up tomorrow. Mrs. Reynolds. Will there? Jay, well, dua. Mrs. Reynolds. Well, dua, then you'll come back tomorrow, and you'll paint over it a second time. Jay, and there'll be more again the day after. Mrs. Reynolds. And you'll come back that day. And you'll come back the day after that. The boy that runs the shop on Carlisle Street. I knew his dad, he'll chuck cans of white paint my way as long as I like. Jay, what's the point painting over graffiti, when there's gonna be more up tomorrow? Mrs. Reynolds. Because every day for 7 years I have been reminded that Natal is a slag and a prostitute, and I have had enough. She gathers herself. Mrs. Reynolds. I'll finish that, planting the sunflower. You get started on that wall. Jay, Jesus, what did your last slave die of? Mrs. Reynolds. Exhaustion. Why'd you ask? Jay fiddles feebly with the paint tin. Jay can't get the lid off. Mrs. Reynolds. Bring it here. Jay does as is told. Mrs. Reynolds tries to prise the lid off with her fingertips. Fails. She looks round the planter. Mrs. Reynolds. Pass me that stone. Jay moves. Mrs. Reynolds. No, the flat one. Jay passes Mrs. Reynolds a stone. She slots the stone under the rim of the lid and tries again. Still no good. Mrs. Reynolds. Well, you're not going till the job's done. She hands the tin back to him, returns her attention to the sunflower. Jay stares daggers at her. Then lifts the lid off the paint tin, easily and without any fuss. He begins to paint the wall, his back to Mrs. Reynolds. After a moment Mrs. Reynolds stops what she's doing, watches him. Mrs. Reynolds. My husband would have knocked you into the middle of next week, for even looking at me the way you did just then. Jay, not really turning to look at her. What's he gonna do, bash me with his Zimmer frame? Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds has passed on. Jay, and now he looks at her. Passed on? You mean his worm food? Mrs. Reynolds worked every day from 16 to 65. Saw to it his kids went for nothing. Hundreds turned out for his funeral. He did more good in a morning than you'll do your whole life. Jay, beat. Who even gives a toss? Mrs. Reynolds controls herself, but Jay knows he's found a weak spot. Jay, where are your kids then? Don't notice them coming around to keep you safe from enjoying the word, ruffians like me. Mrs. Reynolds. Ben lives in Glasgow, and Rhiannon has a family in Australia. Jay, bloody hell, Mrs. R., good mum, were you? Mrs. Reynolds. I'm very proud my children are independent enough, they can go anywhere they want and make new lives for themselves. Jay, no you're not. Course you bloody aren't. Mrs. Reynolds. I speak to my grandchildren over the internet 2 or 3 times a week, more than when they lived here. Jay, maybe it wasn't you. Maybe it was Mr. R. Did your little Rhiannon ever get a bit nervous around him? Say after she started to blossom. I mean I used to run away, but only down the end of the street. Australia though. You can't run much further than that. Can you? He turns away, returns to painting. Mrs. Reynolds. You useless little piece of shit. Jay, turning back to her. Easy Mrs. R. But there is such fury in her that his nerve deserts him. There's a moment when he's too frightened to speak, and she's too angry. Jay, look. You know, this is pointless. You know that. Mrs. Reynolds. You're still going to bloody do it. For however long I like. Jay, right, you sweep up the pavement in front of your house. Why'd you bother? Mrs. Reynolds. It won't sweep itself. Jay, it's the pavement. It's not yours. Mrs. Reynolds. It's in front of my house. Jay, so? Mrs. Reynolds. If the pavement in front of my house is filthy, it upsets me. When people drop crisp packets, and cigarette packets, and let their dogs defecate right in front of my house, I hate it. Jay, when kids do graffiti, they are doing the same as you, when you sweep the pavement. Mrs. Reynolds, sorry. Jay, the pavement. It's not yours. But it's part of your life. So you try and make it yours. You sweep it up. You keep it clean. If you're a kid, you've got nothing. Not a house, not a garden. You've got the street you walk along. The bit of wall by the shop. The bus stop. Nothing really. But what you've got. You try and make it your own. You sign your name. You tag. Everywhere you go. And soon the city is your home. It shouts your name as you pass. Beat? It's the same. What you do. What they do. Mrs. Reynolds, it is a little the same, I suppose. Jay, what, are you listening, finally? Mrs. Reynolds, what I do, sweeping up broken glass, hosing down dog crap, makes the world better, for everyone. Foul language scrawled everywhere you look, makes things worse. So they're not the same at all. Jay, it's not foul language. Mrs. Reynolds, clearly it is. Jay, that's just how we talk. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm sick of you how you talk. We all are. Jay, I can't win, can I? Jay gets back to painting. Mrs. Reynolds, but do you know what you did there? Jay, infinitely weary, no. Mrs. Reynolds, it wasn't threats, it wasn't excuses, it wasn't lies. You tried to reason with me. Like a civilized young man. Jay, lot of good it did me. Mrs. Reynolds, you're right, progress should be rewarded. Jay, like how? Mrs. Reynolds, you say there's no way this wall will be graffiti-free in the morning. Jay, it's like a whatchamacall, a blank. Mrs. Reynolds, canvas. Jay, yes. You're asking people to tag it. Mrs. Reynolds, prove yourself wrong. Keep this wall clean for one night, and we'll call it quits. Jay, what, I stay here. All night? Mrs. Reynolds, it's warm. It's not going to rain. And don't tell me you've never stayed up all night before. Jay, and then I can go. You'll sign my report, and you'll never hassle me again. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, I love it. In your head, I'm hassling you. Jay, but that's the deal. Mrs. Reynolds, if I can walk down my own street, just one bright morning, and not be faced with filth and foul language, yes. If you do that for me, we're even. Jay, shake on it. Jay offers his hand. Mrs. Reynolds takes it. They shake. Scene 5. Later in the day. Jay is sitting on the bench, listening to music from his mobile. Light begins to fade. Jay gets bored of music. Begins playing a game on his phone. It's getting darker. Jay's battery runs out. He puts the phone away. Tugs his jacket tighter around himself. Darker still. Jay gets out a cigarette. Smokes it. Settles. Starts to doze. Kieran, mate. Jay comes awake. Kieran, sup. Jay, nothing. Kieran approaches, they shake. Kieran, coming into town. Jay, in a bit. Kieran, what you doing? Jay, not much. Kieran, not much. Jay, beat. Sitting. Kieran, so, you coming then? Jay, yeah, no, I'm just gonna hang here a bit. Kieran, hang here. Jay, yup. Kieran looks around, trying to find the attraction of here. Kieran, why? Jay, what the fuck do you care? Kieran, mate, I don't. I'm just. Stung by Jay's reprimand, Kieran has pulled back a bit. Out of the corner of his eye he notices the wall. Kieran. Oh my gosh. He gets up. Kieran, have you seen this? Jay, what? Kieran, this wall. Jay, meaning, what are you getting excited about, dot? It's a wall. Kieran, it is a pure, pristine, beautiful, white wall. Jay, so ve you seen Damien? We was going down Apollo's and he jibbed out last minute. Kieran pulls out a marker pen. Kieran, it is my pristine, white wall. He pulls off the top of the marker. Gives it a little sniff for luck. Jay, oi oi Kieran. Kieran, what mate? Jay gets up. Jay, all right, come on, let's head into town then. Kieran is considering the wall where he should start, and with what. Kieran, in a second mate. He chooses his spot. He's just about to write on the wall. And Jay grabs his hand. Jay, you can't. Kieran pulls free. Kieran, you what? Jay, you can't touch it. Kieran, yeah, I can. Jay, you do. I will fucking end you, mate. Kieran looks at him. Smiles. Kieran, come again. Jay, you heard me. Kieran, is this, are there cameras? Are we on TV? Jay, it's not a joke. Kieran, what then? Jay, beat. Can't say. Kieran, what, is it secret? Is it top secret? Are you like a spy, and keeping this wall clean is your secret mission? Jay, don't take the piss, mate. Kieran, don't you take the piss, then. Beat. Kieran, is it your community service? Jay says nothing. Kieran, is it? What, they got you to paint the wall and now they are making you stand guard? Jay, something like that. Kieran, they can't do that, mate. You've got rights. They can't have you standing out here all night. Anything could happen. Jay, don't I know it? Kieran, that's got to be dodgy, though. You should tell your solicitor. Have you told your solicitor? Jay, no. Kieran, you should, mate. Jay, yeah, I will. Kieran, I could punch you and then you can sue. Say you were attacked. Jay, can't afford to sue anyone, can I? Kieran, no win no fee, mate. Your legal costs will be paid by the insurers of the third party in it. Jay, you are not gonna punch me, and that is the end of it. Kieran, all right, all right. Jay goes back to the bench. Kieran, so what, you gotta keep anyone from graffitiing this wall? Kieran looks at the wall. Still has the marker in his hand. Jay, right. Kieran, gotta keep it perfect. He's reaching out towards the wall with the pen. Jay, Kieran. Jay not looking at him. He doesn't need to. Kieran, what? Jay, come here, sit down. Kieran does as he is told. Kieran, so, you're gonna stay here all night? Jay, yup. Kieran, beat. No, you ain't. Jay looks at him. Kieran, come on, mate, as if. Jay laugh it up. Kieran, you know what you're like though. Jay, what am I like, mate? You tell me. Kieran, don't be a little bitch. Jay looks at him, looks away. Kieran, by the way, saw your sister earlier. She said, what was it? Jay, she said, Key, do you have any idea how annoying you are? Kieran, oh yeah, she said give it to me, Kieran, give it to me hard, like the slut I am. Jay, when did you see my sister? Kieran, when did I shag your sister? Last night. Tried to call you so you could listen in. Jay, well, I was busy, shagging your mum. Kieran, I was shagging your nan. Jay, I was shagging yours. Kieran, my nan's dead. Jay, I thought she was a bit quiet. And smelly. Kieran, I loved my nan, mate. Jay, and I did. 3 times a week, twice on Fridays. Kieran, beat. You're really just sitting here, all night? Jay, that's what I said. Kieran, I'm going by KFC, why don't you come with? Jay, cause I'm staying here. Kieran, gonna need a feed, maintain your energy levels. Jay, I'm as energetic as I need to be, mate. Kieran, I'd bring you some, but I'm off to Boyce's. Jay, I'll be alright, mate. Kieran, get a coffee, few cokes, keep you going. Be gone half an hour tops. Jay, nah, I'm good. Kieran, beat. Boyce'll have a bit of speed tucked away somewhere. If you're staying up all night. Jay looks at him, doesn't answer. Kieran is triumphant. Kieran, on your feet, soldier. Kieran springs up. Jay, straight to Boyce's then. Kieran, KFC first. Jay, KFC, Boyce's for the speed. Then I'm coming right back. Kieran smiles. Kieran, course you are, mate. Scene 6. The next morning. The sunflower is ripped up. On the wall has been scrawled Stacy likes cock. Mrs. Reynolds is sitting on the bench, waiting. Jay arrives in the same clothes he was wearing last night. He's haggard and bleary. Mrs. Reynolds, you're here. Wonderful. Now, this is worth taking a look at. She gets up, goes over to the wall. Mrs. Reynolds, because there are people who say, Does spelling really matter? So long as you can get your message across, who cares if words are spelled how a stuffy old dictionary says they should be? The graffiti. But see, someone is trying to tell us something about Stacy. Is it that she likes cock? Or that she licks it? I can't be sure. And why not? Because of poor spelling. JC, that is bad luck. Mrs. Reynolds, is it? J, that can only be happened like 5 seconds ago, 'cause I was here the whole time. Mrs. Reynolds touches the graffiti. Mrs. Reynolds, ink's not wet. J, half an hour ago then, tops. I was here all night, popped off to get a coffee, just my luck. That's when some little vandal wanders past with his marker pen. Mrs. Reynolds, where is your coffee, then? J, drank it. Mrs. Reynolds, I looked out 11:30 last night, you were nowhere to be seen. J, 11:30. I was seat of pants to seat of bench. Did you have your specs on? Mrs. Reynolds, I came out 12:30, you were gone. J, about 12:30 I might have stretched my legs, walked up and down the street, but. Mrs. Reynolds, I knew you couldn't do it. J, beat. Did you? Mrs. Reynolds, 100% certainty. J, did you think I was gonna sit up all night? Who in the world would do that? Mrs. Reynolds, have you ever seen the sea, J? The tiniest hesitation before he answers. J, course. Mrs. Reynolds, you know nothing about the world, but hark at you telling us all how it is. J, I know more than you, sat in your nice little house. The real world is a jungle. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, that's brilliant. It's a jungle. And what are you, J? A lion? A tiger? No, J, the jaguar, stalking the streets of the urban jungle. That's marvelous. J, is it? Mrs. Reynolds, oh sorry, a jaguar is a big cat, bit like a leopard or a panther. Just in case you didn't know. J, controlled. You know it really pisses me off when you laugh at me. Mrs. Reynolds, there he goes, J, the jaguar, stalking down to the dole office, to sign on the line and get his pocket money. J, a player plays the. Mrs. Reynolds, the system, I know. I've heard it before. I've heard all your excuses, and I am sick of them. She looks at him. Mrs. Reynolds, when my kids were little, a sliver of mercury above 98, and I'd sit up with them all night. J, beat. I don't know what that means. Mrs. Reynolds, if they had a hint of a temperature. We measured it in Fahrenheit. I would watch them. I would count every breath. From the moment they laid down their head. Till light filled the room. And their eyes opened. Beat? I bet no one ever did that for you. J shakes his head. Mrs. Reynolds, no. And I'm not surprised. J, what? Mrs. Reynolds, my children were angels. You, I dread to think. J, you don't wanna hear what it was like when I was little. Mrs. Reynolds, mummy, not buy you a Game Boy. Oh, poor baby. J, you couldn't take it. Mrs. Reynolds, you have no idea, J, what I can take. J, bollocks. Mrs. Reynolds, I sat with my husband. For 3 days after his heart attack. Counting every breath. Watching the numbers on the machines. Nothing in Fahrenheit by then. J, so what, he died in hospital, nurses and doctors looking after him, you by his side. Mrs. Reynolds, yes. J, sounds nice. Mrs. Reynolds doesn't answer. J, got no comeback for that. I'll say it again, sounds nice. Sounds like an alright way to end a life. Here's how I started mine. When I was little, all I remember is my mum, always sick. And me worrying about her all the time. She had doctors coming every day to give her medicine. Except it wasn't medicine. And the men weren't really doctors. And sometimes she didn't have money. So she'd pay for her medicine in other ways. There was this one bloke. She called him Holloman. I walked into the lounge one day. Found Mum on her knees. In front of him. I didn't know what it meant. After that, Mum put a lock on my door. On the outside. They used to lock me in for my sake. Stop me seeing things I shouldn't. But they'd get so wasted, they'd forget I was there. One time, I had to shit in the corner of my own room. I couldn't help myself. I was 7. It was hurting my belly. Holloman rubbed my nose in it. Held my face down. And rubbed my nose in my own shit. Said that would teach me. He would bring men round. Let them use my mum. Before they locked me in, mum would give me a pot noodle. And the kettle, so I could feed myself. I would eat every mouthful and think. See. My mum loves me, really. One time I heard her screaming. I kicked the door till the lock gave way. Holloman was standing over her, his foot on her throat. I stabbed him in the leg with my penknife. And she threw me out. I was 13. And I don't look to her for nothing these days. I just thank her for everything she taught me. For how strong she made me. Jay looks at Mrs. Reynolds. Jay, sorry, I didn't catch that. Mrs. Reynolds, I didn't say anything. Jay, no, you didn't. Mrs. Reynolds, I think this should all stop now. Jay, yes. Mrs. Reynolds, so it's all finished. The stuff about you stealing my necklace. Jay, the stuff about you framing me for stealing your necklace. Mrs. Reynolds, we can forget that. Jay, oh, can we? That's good to know. Mrs. Reynolds, and we can just stop all this, you coming here, working for me. Jay, I knew I'd win. And I have, haven't I? Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, you've won. Jay, I think I deserve some compensation for the way you've treated me. I'm talking about in cash terms now. That is if you want me to go. From one of her jute bags, Mrs. Reynolds gets out her purse. Jay, don't bother to count it. I'll just take everything you've got. Mrs. Reynolds offers a few notes. Jay, oh, very kind, thank you, don't mind if I do. Mrs. Reynolds, will you go now? Jay, what's your name? Like your first name. Mrs. Reynolds, Anna. Jay, Anna. Sounds like a retard's name. No wonder you were such a fucking spastic all your life. Jay goes. Mrs. Reynolds sits down on the bench. Rests her head in her hand for a moment. Then gets up, suddenly stiff, like a much older woman. Begins to tidy up the remains of the sunflower. Loses heart, throws the bits of plant back in the flower bed. Sits, slumps on the bench. As she sits, a lighting change. Day fades into night. Jay comes back on. His pacing, talking on his phone. Jay Key. I've called you 20 times, mate, come back at me. Dials again. Steve-O coming out. Come on. No. No, fair enough. All right, mate. Hangs up, dials again. Naz, mate, it's me. You in town? Fancy a quick one? Forget about that, do it tomorrow. Come on, mate, just one and I'll. Yeah, no, don't worry about it. Hangs up, dials again. Boise. What you up to? What? Well, sod you then. Dials again. Trevor, mate. Beat? Mate, I can't understand you. Mate, you need to slow down. No, I don't know what that is. Mate, turn the music down and. No, there is music, mate, I can hear it. I can't hear you is the problem. Trev, what have you had? Trev, stop calling me dad. I'm not your dad, Trev. Hangs up, dials again. Damien. You in the mood for a cheeky couple? No. When do you ever say no? Don't you hang up on me, you little. But Damien has hung up. Jay hesitates, dials again. Hey Ricky. It's Jay. Jay, Kieran's mate. Jay that hangs round with Boise. Jay that plays pool with Trev. Jay from that time when you and Damien. No, I didn't. No, I did not. Then he's a liar, isn't he? Dials again. Kieran, mate, this is like the 50th time it's been. A nightmare of a day, I need you to pick up, man. Jay dials again. A number he has to punch out with some care this time. He waits. The pacing has stopped. He's still now, as is Mrs. Reynolds, on the bench. There's an answer. Jay, yeah, it's me. Don't hang up. Don't, please, 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 please. I just wanted to. You okay? Yeah. That's good. That's great. I'm fine. Look, I was thinking. Maybe I could come round. No, 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 nothing like that. Just for a day. For an hour or two. It's your birthday soon. I could bring you a present. Anything you want. Or money, yeah. Money, if that's what you want. If I could just come round. Just for a cup of coffee. Just for 10 minutes. Please. Can I? Please. 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 Mum. To black. Scene 7. Mrs. Reynolds' front garden. Mrs. Reynolds emerges, begins potter around, pulling off diseased leaves, squirting at infested plants with a spray bottle of soapy water, rooting out weeds. Then she turns. Mrs. Reynolds, what do you want? She's half expecting an attack. Jay, you know that money you gave me? I spent it. I need some more now. Mrs. Reynolds, I haven't got any more money for you. Jay, that's the problem, see. You pay someone off. They're gonna want paying again. You have to stand up to people. Or if you don't, they basically fucking own you. And you know what's annoying me? About you. Mrs. Reynolds, I just think. Jay, suddenly snarling. What? What? Mrs. Reynolds recoils. Mrs. Reynolds, I want you to go. Jay, no. Mrs. Reynolds, please. Jay, what you gonna do, call the police? Mrs. Reynolds, I can't help you, Jay. Jay, of course you can't. Help me. How would you? Help me. Mrs. Reynolds, because you're not just a naughty little boy who's gone astray. Jay, oh, I am very naughty. Mrs. Reynolds, you're broken. You were never made right. Mrs. Reynolds gathers up her things. Mrs. Reynolds, please don't bother me anymore. I'm asking nicely. She goes inside. Shuts the front door behind her. Jay doesn't move. Jay, I'm still here. Raising his voice. I'm still here, Mrs. R. Beat, then, really yelling. I got no other pressing appointments to be at. In a flurry of movement, the door opens and Mrs. Reynolds comes out again. She has a phone in her hand. Mrs. Reynolds, all right then. I'll call the police. Jay, go on. Mrs. Reynolds, I will. Jay, have me chucked inside. With all the scum. 'Course that's where I belong. Stand off. Jay, isn't it? She lowers the phone. Jay, I'm not going away. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't know what to do with you. Jay, just tell me something. Give me something to do. What were you doing? Mrs. Reynolds, I was deadheading the roses. Jay, then tell me to do that. Mrs. Reynolds, I was deadheading the roses, Jay. You could help me with that. Jay, all right. All right then. We're getting somewhere. Jay comes into the garden and gets to work on the rosebush. Mrs. Reynolds watches him. Act 2. Scene 1. Music, and the quality of the daylight changes. We're now moving into summer. The flower bed. There's litter everywhere, and the wall is fairly well covered with graffiti. It's mostly tags, declarations of love and hate, but there is also a prominent and skillfully painted flower in a flower pot. Mrs. Reynolds comes on with a bin bag and gets to work on the litter. Jay appears from the other side of stage at a run. Jay, sorry I'm late, again. Runs straight off in the direction Mrs. Reynolds appeared from. Mrs. Reynolds, you're not, you can. Jay reappears, now with a tin of paint and a brush. Mrs. Reynolds, you can turn up when you like. Jay, nah, 10's good. I mean, I say that and then I'm late every day, but 10's good as a target, like. Mrs. Reynolds watches him for a bit as he begins to paint. Mrs. Reynolds, looks like someone's joining in. Jay, sorry. Mrs. Reynolds, we're trying to grow flowers in the flower bed. Someone's drawn a flower on the wall. Almost a pity to paint over it. Jay, then don't. Leave the flower. If you like it, why not? Mrs. Reynolds, because it's vandalism. J, but you like it. Mrs. Reynolds, well, more than the other stuff. J, it makes the place better. Mrs. Reynolds, well, I suppose it does. J, so let's get rid of everything else. And leave the flower up. Mrs. Reynolds nods. J paints, skirting round the flower. Mrs. Reynolds watches him for a while, and then leaves. Time shifts while J finishes the painting. Summer reaches its height. The flower surrounded by white. J leaves the stage. Music, and the lights shift. There are a couple more pictures on the wall. J returns, with a bin bag and one of those grabbing devices that allow you to pick up rubbish without bending. He moves around the stage, listening to music on headphones, nimbly picking up bits of litter with the grabber. Mel enters. Mel, hi. J, all right. Mel, hi. I was wondering if you could help me out. J, taking off his headphones. Sorry. Mel, yeah, I've just moved in over the road and the front garden. There's just a lot of bin bags and old chairs and a fridge and an ironing board, and realizes she's babbling. All the usual rubbish. You probably don't need to know every single item. J, right. Mel, and I was wondering if you could help. J, meaning the grabber. With this. Mel, no, sorry, no. I meant maybe you could radio to base. J, I'm not sure what you. Mel, of course you do pick stuff like that up, don't you? J, not no. Mel, it says you do on your website. Mrs. Reynolds arrives. Mrs. Reynolds, oh hello, I know you, don't I? Mel, I don't think we've met. Mrs. Reynolds, you're the young lady who's just moved in across the road. Mel, well yes, okay then, I am. Mrs. Reynolds offers her hands. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm Mrs. Reynolds. Mel. Mrs. Reynolds, how are you finding things so far, Mel? Mel, I was just hoping our friend here might help me shift a few things from the front garden, but he doesn't seem too keen. Mrs. Reynolds, oh wonderful, 'cause it's a real eyesore, isn't it? I mean, I'm not blaming you. It's a shared house and you've only just moved in, but still. Mel, no, I know. Mrs. Reynolds, but I don't think Jay'll be able to do much. You need to ring the council. They'll collect all that stuff, which makes it all the more bloody annoying. People just leave it to sit there. Mel, doesn't he, oh God, doesn't he work for the council? Mrs. Reynolds, J. Good grief, no. Mel, sorry, I just saw him clearing up, and realizing she's talking about Jay while he stands there. I just walked up and started ordering you about. What must you've thought? Mrs. Reynolds, I'm sure he thought, here's a lovely young woman coming to speak to me, and he will have been very happy about that. Jay, I can talk, you know. Mrs. Reynolds, now, let me get you the number for the waste disposal department. Mrs. Reynolds leads Mel off. Mel, nice to meet you, Jay. And sorry for you know. Jay watches the women leave. Once they are gone. Jay, absolutely no problem at all. Mel. He puts back on his headphones, gets back to picking litter. Time starts to shift again. Music. Summer ripens towards autumn. Mrs. Reynolds and Jay survey newly scrawled message on the wall. Mrs. Reynolds, well, that can go. That can go. That can definitely go. Jay, what about this? Mrs. Reynolds reads. Steve and Ali, true love, 4 years of love. I like that. We'll keep it. Jay passes the Mrs. R taste and decency test. Mrs. Reynolds, the day these so-called graffiti artists start asking permission to spray in my street, then I'll start consulting on what I whitewash. Jay, oh, you're painting these out yourself, are you? Kieran enters. Kieran, all right. Jay, all right, mate. They shake. Mrs. Reynolds, good morning, Kieran. Kieran, is it? Mrs. Reynolds, oh, well done, very good. Kieran, just asking a question. Jay, so what you up to, mate? Kieran, fuck all. Mrs. Reynolds, gosh, that sounds exciting. Jay, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, Master Jay. Jay, just. Mrs. R takes the hint, backs off slightly. Kieran, you hanging here, are you? Jay, for a bit. Kieran, how long's this going on for? Jay, hard to say, mate. Kieran, so, how many hours they give you? Jay, like, hundreds. Kieran, you been doing it for months. Jay, yeah, but she only wants me a half hour a day sometimes. So it takes forever to make up the time. Kieran, stupid cow. Jay, tell me about it. Mrs. Reynolds, if you're going to lurk, Kieran, you could make yourself useful. Kieran, yeah, right. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay says you're a dab hand with a spray can. Why not fill up all the blank spaces on that wall? Kieran, if you want. Mrs. Reynolds, not with filth. With. Kieran, pretty flowers. Mrs. Reynolds, if you like. Kieran, and how much do I get for it? Mrs. Reynolds, get for it. Kieran, no pay, no play. Mrs. Reynolds, you might do it just to make the place look a little better. Kieran, beat. Are you mentally retarded? Jay, key. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay is happy enough to help out for free. Kieran, Jay helps out cause the filth make him. Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Well, of course there is that. Kieran, to Jay. Laters, man. They shake, and Kieran goes. Jay gets on with whitewashing. Mrs. Reynolds, you tell your friends you help me, because you have to. Jay, I don't tell them nothing. Mrs. Reynolds, but they assume. And you don't correct them. Jay, and Mrs. Reynolds, and beat. And that's fine. Look, I wanted to give you these. She gets an envelope from her pocket, gives it to Jay. He looks inside. Mrs. Reynolds, they are seeds. From the first sweet peas. Jay, the ones with the smell. Mrs. Reynolds, plant them now, or keep them somewhere dry over the winter, and sow them in the spring. Jay, I haven't got no garden. Mrs. Reynolds, your nan's flat, you said she's got a little balcony. Plant them in pots, grow them up the railings. Bet she'd love that. Jay, yeah. See, when I say, I live at my nan's, I do, but it's more I sleep there. Like I can't come in before 11, and I crash in the lounge, and I've got to be gone before she gets up. Which is alright actually, cause she never really surfaces before midday. He hands the seed packet back. Jay, so probably best you keep them. Scene 2. Time has passed. Now we're well into autumn. Mrs. Reynolds' jobs in September are pruning, cutting back dead growth, planting bulbs for spring, then dressing the soil with compost or richly rotted manure, which the frost will break down for us over the winter. Jay, if we get any frost. Mrs. Reynolds, and if we don't, you can dig the manure in come New Year. So, bulbs. Jay, they go in the ground. She shows him a bulb. Mrs. Reynolds, you see this side? That's where the shoots come from. So you plant it with that side up. Then, on the bottom, these little straggly things are the roots. Jay, and you put them face down. Mrs. Reynolds, that's right. Jay, look a bit like onions, don't they? Mrs. Reynolds, I wouldn't eat them, though. Jay, they poisonous. Mrs. Reynolds, no, because if you do, I'll give you a clip round the ear. Mel walks by. Mel, hello. Mrs. Reynolds, lovely morning. Mel, gardening again. Mrs. Reynolds, yes we are. Mel, sorry, obviously you are. I mean, I saw you on my way, I was in the grocer's just now. They had these plants they were just giving away, and I thought you might want them. Mrs. Reynolds, that's very kind of you, but I don't think I've got an inch of space. Mel, oh no, I meant for the flower bed, down the road. I've seen you looking after it. And then I've seen kids destroying it. Must be costing you a bomb to keep buying new plants. Mrs. Reynolds, you've seen kids vandalizing the flower bed. Mel, well, yeah. Mrs. Reynolds, and you shouted at them. Called the police. Mel, I didn't see them, really, I was in my flat. I saw them through the window. I didn't think to. Mrs. Reynolds, do anything. Mel, well, no. Mrs. Reynolds, of course not. Why on God's earth would anyone do anything? Jay, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, what? Jay looks at her. Jay, she brought you some plants. Remember? Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Sorry. Ignore me. Pounding headache. Just nipping inside for some aspirin. Mrs. Reynolds puts down her tools and goes. Mel, bit fierce, isn't she? Jay, she has her moments. Mel, it's Mrs. Reynolds Street, the rest of us just live here. That's what I was told. J. Who by? Mel, I don't dare say, don't want to get them in trouble. Seems to like you. Though. J. I'm a likable guy. Mel, are you, really? J. looks at Mel. Mel holds his gaze. J. looks away. J. Anyway, I'd best be getting on. Mel offers up the bag. Mel, so these plants. J. takes the bag from her. J. Yeah, sure. He takes a look. Yeah, the thing with these is they're what you call summer bedding plants. You put them in, say, the spring, the start of the summer. But now it's Mel, the end of the summer. J. Which, to be honest, is probably why they were giving them away. Mel, cause they are no good. J. Stick them in your garden, never know, they might grow again in the spring. Mel, yeah, I might. Beat? I wouldn't know how though, I'd kill them straight off. J. Soak the plant in the pot. Dig a hole, loosen the earth. In the bottom. Pull the plant out of the pot. It'll come easy cause you soaked it. Loosen the root ball. Stick it in the hole. Firm the earth around it. And water in well. Mel, okay. J. Easy really. Mrs. Reynolds enters. J. Mrs. R. I was just saying, she might as well stick these in her garden, see if anything comes up in the spring. Mel, I was explaining to J, I wouldn't have a clue how to do that. J. and I was just saying to her, it's the simplest thing. Mrs. Reynolds, I see. Mrs. Reynolds is very aware of the way Mel is looking at J. Mel and I would give it a go, but our garden's split between the 3 flats you see, so no one really bothers, and it's all overgrown with massive brambles and nettles and things, so be a bit of a waste, really. J. No problem at all. J. picks up a billhook and offers it to her. J. Billhook'll sort that out for you. Mel, right. Mel takes the billhook, hefts it. Looks to Mrs. Reynolds. Mel, well, thanks for that. I'll get it back to you, the billhook, soon as I can. Mel goes. J. gets back to work. Mrs. Reynolds, not your type, then. J. What? Mrs. Reynolds, Mel. Who was clearly angling to get you to come round and give her a hand. J. I know, cheeky bitch. Mrs. Reynolds, no, not because, good God, how does the race perpetuate itself? She likes you. J. Beat. Oh yeah, I know that. Mrs. Reynolds, oh for goodness sake. Mrs. Reynolds, get on with some little task, so she's not looking at J. J. No, I mean, I knew she did, obviously. Just good to get a female perspective. Mrs. Reynolds, still without looking at him. You going to then? J. If Mel wants a little sugar from the J-Meister. Who am I to deny? Mrs. Reynolds stops what she's doing and looks at him. J. What? Mrs. Reynolds shakes her head, gets back to her task. Scene 3. Mel's garden. J. flushed from hacking back weeds. Carrying a billhook. Mel enters, with some cans. J. That's the worst of it done. Mel, you want a drink? J. Please. Mel offers him a can of lager. J. Cheers. J. cracks open the can, and drinks deeply. Mel watches. Mel hit the spot. J. Oh yeah. He drinks again. Mel watches again. J. becomes aware of her watching. J. What? Mel thirsty then. J. Thirsty work. Mel, you shouldn't quench a thirst with booze. Bad for you. J. offers the empty can. J. I haven't. Still parched. Mel offers him another can. J. Anybody'd think you were trying to get me drunk. Mel, you're full of yourself. J. It's all a front. J. Beat. Nah, it's not. Mel opens a can. Mel, I remember the first time I saw you. I remember thinking, what an idiot. J. Oh, cheers. Mel, no, it was cause you were painting over graffiti. And I thought, why's he bothering with that? Kids'll just come do more, the little bastards. And all those plants you stuck in the flower bed. They all got pulled up and ripped to shreds. I remember getting annoyed with you. J. I annoyed you, before you even knew me. That might actually be a record. Mel, exactly, you were just some guy. On the street, who I didn't even know. And you were so pissing me off. I remember thinking. Just stop it, just stop even trying. Why are you wasting all that effort, all that time? Jay. All those plants. Mel, there was once. It must have been you planted seeds. Rather than sticking plants in. Because they came up, slowly. Little buds at first, then a few leaves. Jay, the nasturtiums. Mel, and they actually survived for ages. It was like cause they grew, gradually. The kids didn't notice them, not till they got quite big, and then. Jay, then the kids did notice them. Mel, I came past one morning and there were all the leaves and stalks just thrown around. I was so sad. Then you came out, gathered all the bits up. Not annoyed. Not angry. Just started again. Just planted new seeds. I was watching you from my window. I remember thinking. Beat? And then I saw you helping Mrs. Reynolds with her garden as well, and I thought. What a sweetheart, helping that Jay grumpy old bag. Mel helping that grumpy old bag with her garden. What a star. Jay, it's just now and again. Mel, it's every day. I see you, every bloody day. Jay, spend a lot of time watching me, then. Mel, suppose I do, yeah. Jay, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Mel, is it weird? Or is it, just? Jay, what? Mel, just, when I was younger. I was into troublemakers, you know. Bad boys. And now the guy like you. Jay, a guy like me what? Mel, now. I'm into a guy like you. Jay, are you? Mel, you know it. You do. And this is maybe the moment to say. You might be into a girl like me, too. Mel waits for him to say something. He just takes a drink. Jay, some people would tell you I'm a troublemaker. Mel, oh yeah, you definitely look it. Picking up litter and hanging out with old ladies. Jay says nothing. Mel, what I really like about you is that you keep coming back. Day after day. You're not full of shit. In the way most guys, you know. Really are. Beat? And anytime you feel like you want to come over here and kiss me, then you should probably just do that. Jay looks at her and smiles. Scene 4. The flower bed. Later the same night. Kieran is at work. He's sprayed the letters F and U and is working on a C, making them big enough that the finished 4-letter word will cover the whole wall. Jay enters, walking home from Mel's. He watches for a while, silent. Jay, all right, mate. Kieran, Jesus Christ, I nearly shat myself then. Jay, what you up to? Kieran, beat. What's it look like? Jay, you know she'll make me paint over that. Kieran, she can't make you do anything. Jay says nothing. Kieran, where you been? Jay, only on an actual real-life date. Kieran, what? Jay, dinner, and wine, and the whole shebang. Kieran, I thought you looked chuffed with yourself. You do the deed. Jay, might have. Kieran, that's a no then. Jay, just playing it slow. Kieran, and who is the lucky blind girl? Jay, you know that Mel. Kieran, just moved in over there. Jay, that's the one. Kieran, are you shitting me? Jay, what? Kieran, mate, she has been round the place like a rash. Jay, piss off. Kieran, parachute Mel, everyone gets a jump. Jay, you've got her mixed up, mate. Kieran, she's done Robbie, she's done Trey, she's done Naz, she's done Naz's little cousin. She's done Will, she's done Brett. Jay, no way. Kieran, oh my god, she's done Steve Olsen. I've seen the photos on his phone. Jay says nothing. Kieran, and I mean, he's a sick bastard. You know the stuff he does. Imagine that. Going with a girl. After he's had her. It'd be like you were Steve Olsen's bitch. Beat? Seeing her again. Jay, shut it, Key. Kieran, maybe take her to a movie. Maybe take in a show. Treat her real nice. After Steve OS treated her. Like meat. Or maybe Steve'll be taking her out. And you'll be sitting home looking after her kid. Beat? She did tell you that, didn't she? Of course she did. On your actual date. She's got a kid. And she gave it up. I mean, you did know that, didn't you, mate? Jay, beat. I'll see you, mate. Jay moves off abruptly. For once they part, without shaking hands. Kieran, see you. Jay. Kieran stands. Picks up his aerosol, gives it a shake. Gets back to spraying. Scene 5. Next day. The flower bed. Jay is whitewashing the wall. Mrs. Reynolds is struggling to pick up litter with the grabber. She gives up. Stretches her fingers. Mrs. Reynolds, do you want to swap? She offers him the litter grabber. Jay doesn't respond. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay. Jay, snapping. What? Mrs. Reynolds looks at him. Jay, I've known him since I was there. Mrs. Reynolds, you're telling me Kieran's never lied to you? Jay, not about anything that matters. Mel enters. Mel, morning all. Mrs. Reynolds, right. We'll get this sorted out now. Mel, oh God, what have I done? Mrs. Reynolds, you've done nothing, my love. But someone else has been feeding Jay's head with stories. Jay, Mrs. R. Mel, what stories? Jay, seriously, drop it. Mrs. Reynolds, best these things are out in the open. Jay, maybe not out in the street, though. Mrs. Reynolds, will you just trust me? For once. Mel, you're panicking me now. Mrs. Reynolds, it's nothing to fret about. Just a silly little friend of Jay's getting a bit jealous, spreading a bit of muck. Mel, what sort of muck? Mrs. Reynolds, let's just say he was besmirching your reputation. Jay, he said you had a kid. But you gave it up. Mel, right. Mrs. Reynolds, it's almost sweet, him trying to come between you cause he wants Jay all to himself. Mel? Mel says nothing. Mrs. Reynolds realizes she's put her foot in it. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, bollocks. Right, I'm going to pop back to the house. Mrs. Reynolds vanishes. A pause. Mel gets out a photo. Mel, that's him. Mikey. Jay, cute, yeah. Jay hands the photo back, returns to whitewashing the wall. Mel, after he was born. Things weren't easy. I got into a bit of a mess. I just wanted to be a good mum. And I couldn't. Jay doesn't respond, just keeps on painting. Mel, the doctors said it was postnatal depression. I couldn't look after him, cause I was in such a state myself. My mum and dad took him. We decided they'd have him till I was back on my feet. That was 2 years ago, now. Jay keeps working. Mel, is that even the bit that bothers you? I bet it's not. I bet it's the other stuff. Jay stops what he's doing. Mel, well, whatever your mate told you. It's probably true. When I was feeling bad. When I was feeling such a complete failure. I'd go out, and knowing I could pull. I could make some man want me. Well, it helped. It kept me going. Beat? Or at least to start with. After a bit it made me feel like I was giving myself away. Jay goes back to painting. Jay, without looking at her. Yeah, well, you were. Mel, and you've hardly been a choir boy, have you? She watches him. Mel, I'm complete disaster. As a mum, that you can swallow. But what actually bothers you is I've shagged some blokes. You might see down the pub. You're thinking about it now. Who they were. What I did with them. Well, the answer is I did pretty much everything to anybody. And I'm not happy about it. I'm certainly not proud. And now the wall is completely white again. But Jay still cannot look at her. Mel, do you even like me? Jay, why would I give a toss if I didn't like you? Mel, I like you as well. Jay, it's different with boys. When another boy's had your girl, it's too much. Mel, then be a man. Be a man, and tell me. None of that stuff matters. Finally he turns to her. Jay, look at you. Mel what? What? Jay you're lovely. Mel am I? Jay yeah. Yeah you are. Mel that's nice to hear. Jay what you doing Saturday? Mel hanging out with my son. Jay okay. Mel you could tag along. If you wanted. Scene 6. Mrs. Reynolds' front garden. Night. Several weeks later. Mel walks up to the front door, knocks. No response. Mel Mrs. R. Was there a noise inside? Mel Mrs. R. Was that you? Mel listens carefully. She pushes open the letterbox. Mel Mrs. R. Are you alright? Beat? Oh my god. Mrs. R. The door opens. Mrs. Reynolds I'm fine. I'm fine. Mrs. Reynolds is looking disheveled. Mel what happened? Mrs. Reynolds just need a bit of air. When she moves, we see she's limping. Mel what have you done? Mrs. Reynolds nothing. Beat? Sorry. Mel that's alright. Mrs. Reynolds it's my own bloody fault. I never bother with Christmas and I thought, this year, might as well, and I remembered stuffing decorations up on top of the wardrobe. I was reaching to get them. Mel you should use the stepladder when you're reaching for things. Mrs. Reynolds or I bloody was. I'm not an idiot. Beat? Sorry. Again. Mel it's alright. Again. Mrs. Reynolds I was using the stepladder. My leg gave way. Mel but you're okay. In yourself. Mrs. Reynolds, about to snap. Yes, I'm. Mrs. Reynolds catches herself. Mrs. Reynolds I'm fine. Thank you very much for your concern. Mel no problem. Mrs. Reynolds serves me right, fussing around with decorations when it's just me on my own. Mel it's nice to make a bit of an effort. Mrs. Reynolds I did think, maybe you and Jay and Mikey could come round for Christmas dinner, if you're not. Mel no, I'd like that. And Jay it'd be free food, so. Mrs. Reynolds well that's lucky, cause to be honest I've already ordered the turkey oh. You wanted something, didn't you? Mel not really. Mrs. Reynolds and hark at me, rabbiting on. Mel you've had a shock. Mrs. Reynolds what can I do for you? Mel Jay was supposed to be round at 7 and. Mrs. Reynolds and you wondered if I had him stuck here doing jobs for me. Mel I wondered, if you'd seen him, is all. Mrs. Reynolds I haven't, as it happens, not today. Have you tired? She pulls up. Yes, of course you've tried phoning. Mel a couple of times, I don't want to hassle him but. From off, the sound of Jay singing, we wish you a Merry Christmas. Mrs. Reynolds Somebody's had an early dose of Christmas cheer. Jay staggers on, still singing. One hand under his jacket. Mel moves towards him. Mrs. Reynolds does no one know any proper carols anymore? That's all you ever hear, we wish you a Merry Christmas, on and on, what about the old songs, Good King Wenceslas? Mel look at the state of you. Jay and look, at the state of you too. Mel you are a wreck. Jay you are gorgeous. Mel where have you been? Jay beat. On adventures. Mel with who? Jay mates. Mel I phoned all your mates. Jay I was out with new mates. Who were not mates at the start of the night. They are now. Mel I said I was going to cook. Jay brilliant, I'm starving. Mel I was going to cook for 7 o'clock. Jay alright, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds oh I'm fine. Jay to Mrs. Reynolds. You wanna get in, it's freezing out here. Mel I was cooking for 7. It's 10:15. Jay looks at her for a long time. Then almost excitedly. Jay is it? Mel yeah. Jay no way. Mel and what's that on your trousers, is it piss or vomit? Jay looks down at his trousers. He considers. Then announces, with huge dignity. Jay neither of the above. Mel you've had such a great time with your mates, you get back to them. Jay Mel. Jay extends his hand towards her, tries to cup her cheek. She pushes him away. Jay don't be like that. Mel get lost. Mel realizes there's something wet on her cheek, where Jay touched her. Mel, what the hell is this? She dabs at her cheek. Sniffs her fingers. Mel, Jay. Jay, come on, let's be nice. Don't you wanna be nice? Mel, what's happened to you? Mrs. Reynolds, what is it? Jay, can we go in please cause I'm really freezing. Mel catches Jay's hand. Mel, oh my god, that's blood. Jay. Mel opens his jacket. The bottom half of his shirt is drenched in blood. Jay, I might have to sit down. Jay slides to the floor. Mrs. Reynolds, I'll get an ambulance. Mrs. Reynolds heads inside to phone. Jay, just gonna lie down for a bit. Mel takes off her coat, lays it over him. Mel, no, listen, you can't. You can't sleep, baby. You have to stay awake. Jay. You have to stay with me. To black. Scene 7. Mrs. Reynolds' living room. Something of a spread on the table. Mrs. Reynolds leads Mel and Jay in. Jay straight away heads to the table and starts picking. Jay of the spread. This is a bit much, isn't it? Mrs. Reynolds' Christmas leftovers. All got to be eaten before it goes off. Jay, you really go to town, don't you? Mrs. Reynolds, not normally. This year. I was planning to have people round. Jay, anyone I know? Mrs. Reynolds looks at him. Jay, oh right me. Mel, who else do you think? Jay, to Mel. Her kids could have been coming home. Mrs. Reynolds, it was going to be you, and Mel, and Mikey. Jay, alright. Sorry to ruin everyone's plans by selfishly getting stabbed. Off Mel's look. What? To Mrs. Reynolds. I'll see what I can do to get rid of this little lot now. And, you know, there's always next year. Mrs. Reynolds, beat. Yes, there is. A knock at the door. Mrs. Reynolds, I'll go. Jay, who's that? Mel, dunno. Jay, sensing something is up. Really? Mel, let me have a look at your dressing. Jay, my dressing's all right. Mel, so what's it matter if I have a look? Jay, no. Mel, Jay. They stare at each other. Then with huge weariness. Jay, all right. Jay pulls up his shirt, the big bandage taped to his stomach, tape winding right round him to hold it on. Mel, that looks fine. Don't know what you're making such a fuss about. Mrs. Reynolds enters. And with her, Cassie. Jay, looks like I've been set up again. Mrs. Reynolds, I asked Cassie to come here today. Jay, to Mel, you were in on this, weren't you? Mel, you got stabbed, Jay. Mrs. Reynolds, and we don't feel you're taking it seriously enough. Jay, don't we, really? Mrs. Reynolds, oh, for goodness sake. Mel, Jay. Jay, to Cassie. You got anything to say for yourself? Cassie, yes. As it happens. Mrs. Reynolds, and actually listen. Jay, will you give me a break for 1 second? Cassie waits for silence. Cassie, you might remember, we talked about how hard it is for people to get out of offending behavior once they're involved with the criminal justice system. Jay, you might have talked about that, don't think I did. Jay is aware that Mel and Mrs. Reynolds are deeply unimpressed by him right how. Jay, okay, get on with it. Cassie, you start with the best intentions in the world, but you're walking the same streets, seeing the same people. Jay, I'm not seeing the same people. Mrs. Reynolds, you got stabbed. Jay, yeah. That's right. Someone stabbed me. Not me doing the stabbing. Cassie, so there's someone out there now who stabbed you. Jay, and perhaps he should be getting your attention. Mel, so it was a he. Jay, beat. Yeah. I'm guessing. Mel, you said you couldn't remember a thing. Jay, it wasn't anyone I knew. Mel, how do you know that, if you can't remember a thing about what happened? Mrs. Reynolds, would you remember his face if you saw him again? Jay, they're never gonna catch him, are they? Cassie, but if you saw him, you'd recognize him. Jay, might do. Mel, so if you saw him down the pub you'd know his face. Jay, maybe. Cassie, and what then, Jay? Mel, what'll you do? When you see this guy again? Jay, nothing. Cassie, nothing. Jay, just mind my own business. Cassie, you'd let him get away with it. Jay, all right, I'd dial 999. Is that what I'm supposed to say? Cassie, you're not supposed to say anything. I'm asking you to think about what you would actually do. And what the consequences of those actions might be. Jay, that is bollocks, because you've all decided what I'm supposed to say and what I'm supposed to do, so why don't you just spit it out? Mel, if we were a couple. Jay, we are a couple. I thought. Mel, a couple living together. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay, just listen. Mel, and then, if I took Mikey back, we could go on the housing list. Jay, so. Cassie, obviously there can be quite a wait till you get somewhere by there are schemes. Jay, there are always bloody schemes. Cassie, there are places in the north with houses standing empty. Mrs. Reynolds, so you could have somewhere a lot quicker. Mel, and you. And me, and Mikey would be a family. Cassie, and you'd be away from the people and places and situations that might lead you into trouble. Jay, right. Cassie, I know it's a lot to take in. Jay, when you say places in the north, do you mean shitholes? A look between the women. Jay, it just strikes me that if there are houses standing empty, it's 'cause no bastard wants to live in them. Mel, Jay. Mrs. Reynolds, what if you and Mel just go and take a look? Cassie, in fact the council will pay for you to visit the area for a day. Jay, beat. No. Mel, you won't even do this one thing for me. Jay, it was for you, you silly bitch. Mel, what was? Jay, the guy in the pub saying I'd taken on some slag and her little bastard. He called you a slag. I took him outside. Mel, and he stabbed you. Jay, yes. Mel, you could have died. Jay, I didn't know. He had a knife, did I? Mel, 3 inches higher. You would have died. Jay, it was for you. Mel, no it was not. Jay, what, I'm getting stabbed? For my own benefit. Brilliant Christmas I had. Eating hospital crap and eyeing up the matrons. Probably see if I can get myself shot for Easter. Mel, am I a slag? Jay, beat. Anyone who calls my girl a slag is dead. Mel, I don't give a toss what some wanker down the pub says. Jay, well I do. Mel, yeah, exactly. A beat between them. Jay, I can't believe you're not even a little bit grateful. Or flattered. Or something. Mel, what do I tell Mikey? When you come home from the pub dead. Jay, I come home from the pub dead, then I must have become a zombie, so you tell him he has to burn me. Or shoot me in the head. Mel, don't you dare joke about this. Jay, don't you dare use that boy to blackmail me. 'Cause then I might lose my temper. I might do that. Cassie, can I make a suggestion? Mrs. Reynolds, perhaps you better had. Cassie, my suggestion is that we just stop. Because as the emotional temperature rises, it gets harder for any of us to make rational decisions. Jay, this is my town. This is where I grew up. It's not like I'm going out looking for trouble. More specifically to Mel. You're asking me to run. And I don't do that. I do not run away. If you thought for 1 second I ever could, then you've got the wrong idea about me. And you have definitely got the wrong idea about us. Mel looks at him. Then gets up, leaves without a word. Cassie, I'll unsaid, go after her. Mrs. Reynolds, yeah. Cassie leaves, following Mel. Jay and Mrs. Reynolds sit for a moment. Then. Jay, what? Mrs. Reynolds, well, that went exactly how it was always going to. Jay, why'd you bother then? Me leave town? As if. Mrs. Reynolds, that girl loves you. She looks at you, she sees only the good. Only what you are now. Nothing of what went into you. Nothing of the past. Jay, well, I'm not. He stops. Jay, come on, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, what? Jay, I'm not like I used to be. Am I? Mrs. Reynolds is suddenly terribly upset. But she controls it. Jay, what's all this? He moves towards her. Mrs. Reynolds, don't. I'm perfectly fine. I was a silly old woman. And I hoped you had grown up a bit. But what do we learn in the garden? Bad seed doesn't grow at all. Beat? You can't help the way they made you, Jay. He stands back. Jay, fuck you, Anna. Scene 8. The flower bed. Night. Kieran and Jay are graffitiing the wall, passing spray cans between them. Jay, I'm sitting there. My life being carved up. In front of me. And suddenly I'm like, what? What is this? How did this happen? Kieran, you got pussy whipped, mate. Happens to the best of us. Not me, obviously. Jay, and I'm thinking, I took a knife for this crap. Kieran, so that's it then. You and smell, done with. Jay, yeah. Kieran, I might have a crack at that, then. Yeah, she's a slag, but still you would. Jay looks at him. Jay, whatever. Kieran, I'm shitting you, you twat. Beat? Wouldn't touch Steve Orson's sloppy seconds with yours. Jay snatches a spray can from Kieran. Jay, oh. That is funny, mate. Kieran watches Jay paint. Kieran, tell you what is funny. Jay, what? Kieran, that splashback Nathan Mitchell. Jay stops what he's doing. Kieran, I saw him coming out of Valentino's night before last. He was wrecked. Staggering. He turns down some alley for a piss. And while he was there, acorn dick in hand, I came up behind him and slammed his head into the wall. Then stamped on him a bit. Gave him a 1 2 3 4 to the nuts. Jay, you didn't have to do that. Kieran, I know, mate. Jay, no, I mean it. Kieran, course, I'm gonna stops, genuinely confused at Jay's response. Aren't you still on probation? Jay, yes. Kieran, then you need to stay out of trouble for a bit. Jay, here's my problem. Kieran, so what? He stabs you, and he gets away with it. Jay, I was waiting for my moment. Kieran, yeah, except how it looks is. He stabs you, and he gets away with it. Then every other little shit thinks he can have a pop. Now the message has been sent. Jay, I owe you, mate. Kieran shrugs. Kieran, you'd do it for me. They shake. Jay pulls it into a hug. When they break. Kieran, you filthy puff. Scene 9. Mrs. Reynolds' living room. Jay is waiting. On the table, a bottle of scotch and a couple of tumblers. Mrs. Reynolds comes in and hands over a carrier bag. Jay, indicating the bottle. Started early, did we? Mrs. Reynolds, there you go. Jay, what's all this? Mrs. Reynolds, possessions. Or yours. Which you abandoned at Mel's. Jay makes to go. Jay, all right, see you then. Mrs. Reynolds, stay for a cup of tea. Jay, don't drink tea. Mrs. Reynolds, or coffee, whatever you want. Jay, nah, I'm a bit on my way somewhere. Mrs. Reynolds, Mel says you just stopped coming round. Stopped phoning. She hasn't seen you in weeks. Jay, been busy. Mrs. Reynolds, too busy to phone. Jay, seems that way, yeah. Mrs. Reynolds, you could have finished it with her face to face. Shown a bit of backbone. Jay, anything else you wanna lecture me about? Didn't brush my teeth this morning, if you're interested. Mrs. Reynolds, I didn't mean to hector. Jay, apology accepted. Looking into the bag. Half this stuff isn't even mine, who else has she had round there? Christ, once those legs are spread they don't snap shut in a hurry. Mrs. Reynolds, just I expected better. From you. Jay, and why the hell would you do that? Mrs. Reynolds looks at him, then turns away, defeated. Pours herself a drink, offers the bottle to Jay, he indicates no. Mrs. Reynolds, well then fine. Jay, of the carrier bag. This stuff is all crap, you can bin it. He puts the carrier bag down on the table. Jay, so I'll be off. Mrs. Reynolds says nothing. Jay, see you then. But probably not. He starts to move off. Mrs. Reynolds, hold it a sec. Jay, I knew there was something going on. What, Mel's on her way over, is she? Mrs. Reynolds, no, nothing like that. Jay, you're gonna try and talk me into taking her back. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't know that she'd have you. Jay, what, then? Mrs. Reynolds gets up. Moves to some drawers. Mrs. Reynolds, I was having trouble. With my hand, and then my leg. Jay, trouble how? Mrs. Reynolds, the strength going in my hand. My leg giving way underneath. Jay, don't mean to be rude, but you are getting on a bit. Mrs. Reynolds, that's what I thought. Beat? In fact, no, I didn't. She opens a drawer, gets out a big envelope. Mrs. Reynolds, I was at the doctor. I had a bit of a throat infection. It was Dr. Kaber, and you know. She's such a sweetheart, she said. Is there anything else I can help you with? From the envelope, she pulls loose printed sheets and pamphlets. Hands them to Jay. Mrs. Reynolds, this is going to be horrible for you. I'm sorry. Mrs. Reynolds sits back down. Jay scans quickly through the sheets, looking at Mrs. Reynolds every now and again as he reads. She sips at her drink. Jay, so obviously this is what you've got. Motor neurone disease. Mrs. Reynolds nods. Jay, it says there's no cure. You die. Mrs. Reynolds, yes. He sees that she is watching his reaction. And he tosses the papers down onto the table. Jay, tough break. Mrs. Reynolds, that's all you've got to say. Jay, people die on the streets all the time. And a lot younger than you. Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds, we're back to the streets, are we? Jay, the streets is where I live. Mrs. Reynolds, you live with your nan. Jay, I sleep there. I don't live there. Mrs. Reynolds, Jay. I've got months left. Jay, okay. Mrs. Reynolds, what will happen? What could happen now quite quickly? Is that my muscles will waste away. I won't be able to do things for myself. Soon I'll take my last step. I'll be hoisted onto the toilet. The spit will be sucked from my mouth, so I don't drown. A machine will breathe on my behalf. And through all that, my mind will be untouched. I will know everything that happens to me. Jay, sounds bad, yeah. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm not brave enough, Jay. I need help. I need a way out. Jay, beat. What? Mrs. Reynolds, I've tried a few times. But I don't get it right. She looks at him. Mrs. Reynolds, I want you to help me die. Jamie. Mrs. Reynolds, please. Jay, and why me? Mrs. Reynolds, who else would I ask? Jay, your kids. Mrs. Reynolds, too far away. Jay, they couldn't get on a plane. Mrs. Reynolds, it'd break their hearts. Because they care about me. They love me. Jay, but if I help you die. Mrs. Reynolds, you would just leave. Afterwards. No one would know you were here. Jay, hold on, hold on, hold on. You've known for ages. Mrs. Reynolds, yes. Jay, and you kept it secret. And you're telling me tonight. What, to punish me? Mrs. Reynolds, should I have not told you at all? Jay, you should have said sooner. I could have got used to it. That is so selfish. Mrs. Reynolds, probably it was selfish. Probably you're right, but I'm dying, Jay. Perhaps I need to be selfish now. Just to get through it. Jay, you can't announce it out of nowhere. You can't just say, oh, by the way, I'm dying, and I want you to help me kill myself, and thanks very much for popping over. That's not beat. Is it a trick? Mrs. Reynolds, no. Jay, some sort of lesson. You're gonna scare me shitless, and then I'll say I'll be nice and be good, and at the last minute it's all pretend. Mrs. Reynolds, I kept it to myself because I wanted to be free of it. Some conversations, a few moments, when I could just think about getting on with life. Jay, this isn't the world. Little old ladies don't sit in their little old houses thinking about how to top themselves. Mrs. Reynolds, I went to a consultant. There were examinations to see how quickly the disease was taking hold. The news was not good. On the bus, I was starting to panic. About to cry, thinking, Get home, get into the garden. Get to work and you'll be fine. And then, from the end of the street I could see something not right. Desi came out of the shop. He'd spotted some thug on his CCTV. He'd caught the little shit. Sat on him till the police arrived. Beat. And you had destroyed everything. Every plant stamped on, kicked to pieces. The roses were too tough, so you just tore every flower off. Beat. I went in. I curled up and I howled. For my dead mum, my dead dad. My dead husband. They are all gone. You owe me. Jay, no. What we'll do is, I'll look after you. Mrs. Reynolds, you will. Jay, this is it. This is what I'll do. Mrs. Reynolds, no. Jay, I'm offering. I'll look after you. Not a stranger. Someone you know. Someone you can trust. I'll do everything how you want it. I'll move in. It'd be great. It'd suit me. My nan's gonna chuck me out any minute. Mrs. Reynolds, you'll feed me. Wash me. Take me to the toilet. Wipe my backside. You will. You? Beat? All right. Tell me you can do that. Look me in the eye. Jay, I will. I mean, I'll try. I'll do my best. She looks at him. Mrs. Reynolds, your best isn't good enough, I'm afraid. Jay, if it was someone else. Someone better. Would you say yes then? Mrs. Reynolds, but you can help me. Stay with me, and after I pass out, make sure. Jay, what do you mean, make sure? Mrs. Reynolds, you know. Jay, not a chance. Mrs. Reynolds, it would be a kindness. Jay, this is wrong. You know it is. Mrs. Reynolds, I've tried already. Got the pills. Stacks of them. Drop of scotch to wash them down. Couldn't do it. I just sat there, crying. Jay, doesn't that show? You don't really want to die. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't want to die at all. Jay, I thought maybe you were thinking of heaven, or seeing your husband. Mrs. Reynolds, I don't believe in any of that nonsense. Jay, well, I don't know, do I? Mrs. Reynolds, I could live for another 30 years, by rights. I should have decades in me. Want to die? Are you mad? Beat? But I am dying. Whether I like it or not. Jay, look. 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 Can you say you are 100% sure this is the right thing to do? Mrs. Reynolds, of course I'm not. Jay, so you admit you might be wrong. Doesn't it make sense to wait until you're sure you're right? Mrs. Reynolds, I'm afraid, Jay, this is how it is. Being an adult. You make decisions. Half the time you haven't got a clue if what you're doing is right or not. Jay, so you're taking the easy way out. You're not going to fight. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm going to kill rather than die. So I think I must be fighting. Mustn't I? Jay, when are you going to do it? Mrs. Reynolds says nothing. Jay, tell me. Mrs. Reynolds, the second you leave. Jay, tonight. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm getting weaker every day. And I can't risk it. I can't risk getting caught. Jay, this is insane. You could have months yet, you said. Mrs. Reynolds, what I have hated most in all the years since my husband passed is falling asleep on my own. I'm lost. I'm absolutely bloody terrified. And I'm alone. I wish I had someone. But I don't. Jay, is that really how you feel? Mrs. Reynolds nods. Jay, I'll stay. Mrs. Reynolds, what? Jay, if you're going to do it, tonight. If you've made up your mind. I'll sit with you till you fall asleep. Mrs. Reynolds, and then will you make sure I've gotten away? Jay, Mrs. R. She collects herself. Mrs. Reynolds, right. Right then. I'll go and Jay, you want me to come with you? Mrs. Reynolds, I can't have you watch me taking the pills. If you watch me, I won't be able to do it. So will you stay here? J. Yes, okay. Mrs. Reynolds, and you'll still be here when I come back? J. Of course. Are you all right? Mrs. Reynolds, you keep bloody asking me that, and of course, unsaid. I'm not. J. I don't know what else to say. Mrs. Reynolds, just think before you speak. It's a good general rule. Beat? I'll go and do it then. Mrs. Reynolds goes. Jay is left on his own. Gets quite upset for a bit. Collects himself. He stops, listens. Jay, are you all right? Beat? Mrs. R. Footsteps approach. Jay, are you all right? For having asked, again. Sorry. Mrs. Reynolds, I'm fine, thank you. She hesitates for a moment, steadies herself. She is wearing the pearl necklace she planted in Jay's jacket. Jay, nice necklace. Mrs. Reynolds, only decent bit of jewelry I've got. Mrs. Reynolds reaches for the bottle. Mrs. Reynolds, I know you don't like whiskey, but. Jay, no, I'll have some. Mrs. Reynolds pause. Sits down. Lifts her glass. Mrs. Reynolds cheers. They clink glasses, drink. Jay, how long will it take? Mrs. Reynolds, don't know. Probably depends how quick. I polish off this scotch. She knocks back her glass. Refills. Jay, will you tell me things? Mrs. Reynolds, what sort of thing? Jay, I don't know the first thing about you. Mrs. Reynolds, you know my name. Jay, and that's pretty much it. Mrs. Reynolds, we've always had other things to talk about. Jamie. And my stupid life. Mrs. Reynolds, you, for one thing. The right way to plant a bulb, for another. Jay, I don't know where you grew up. Mrs. Reynolds, a farm. Jay, in the country. Mrs. Reynolds, in Wales. Jay, you're Welsh. You haven't got an accent. Mrs. Reynolds, I left 30 years ago. Jay, what was it like? Mrs. Reynolds, it was like. Time was different then. Jay, how? Mrs. Reynolds, in spring you'd be sowing for that year's crops. And there'd be lambing. And calving. In summer there were shanine O's. And sales, and marts. Jay, what's a mart? Mrs. Reynolds, a market. Where you buy and sell animals. Jay, you had animals. What kinds? Mrs. Reynolds, cows and sheep. Cows for beef, not dairy. Geese? Hens for eggs. Dogs, you know, collies, working dogs mostly, but I had a pet, a terrier cross called Susie. Used to sleep on my bed, Mum hated that. Then cats in the barn. Dozens of them, more or less wild, to keep the rats down. We had a few pigs one year, but Dad didn't much like them. Jay, what was wrong with pigs? Mrs. Reynolds, ever tried slaughtering one? Jay, I can honestly say I have not. Mrs. Reynolds, they scream. It's not something you want to hear. Jay, I'll take your word for it. Mrs. Reynolds didn't put me off the sausages, though. Then there'd be harvest, baling the hay. Getting the bales stacked in the barn. Everyone would come and help. Aunties, uncles, cousins, neighbors. So many people in the fields, and these huge meals. Everybody loading up their plates in the kitchen. Going out into the garden to eat. 'Cause there wasn't room in the house. Then in the autumn ploughing, preserving. Blackberrying, fingers stained from juice. And if you weren't careful of the thorns, blood. Blackberry and apple tart, with loads of sugar. The warm smell from the shed. Of Dad cooking up his home brew. Then winter. Sharp air, smoke drifting from chimneys. Wringing the geese's necks, then feathering them. Splitting logs, drying socks on the Rayburn. Christmas, asking the trees permission. Before you cut down the holly. Climbing up a rowan for mistletoe. New Year, and tinkers coming up from Devon. Mostly in vans, but some still with horses and carts. Swapping our goose feathers for sacks of apples. And then this time, the worst time. The dead months when Christmas is gone. But winter's still dragging on. But you get through because you know. In the end, spring will come. Beat? It was like the year had a story to it. You always knew where you were. Jay, it sounds amazing. She indicates the scotch. Mrs. Reynolds, pour us a bit more. Jay does as is asked. Mrs. Reynolds takes a drink. Mrs. Reynolds, my dad. Now there was a man. Firm, you know, took no nonsense, but men in those days could get away with a lot, and well, he never did. Jay, they get away with a lot these days too. Mrs. Reynolds, yes, I know. Beat. Mrs. Reynolds, the one thing you could do would really make him angry was to say you didn't care if I was having an argument with my brother, and Dad heard me saying I don't care. He'd be in there like a shot. He'd say, you must always care. You must. She stops. Mrs. Reynolds, I might prefer to lie down, I think. She moves onto the couch. Jay helps her arrange cushions behind her head. Jay, that okay? Mrs. Reynolds, fine. She drinks. Coughs slightly. Recovers herself. Mrs. Reynolds, I remember when I was about 10. I started getting these terrible headaches. Migraines, I suppose. I'd be seeing colors. Throwing up. I'd have to lie in a dark room, crying from the pain. And the worst thing was I could feel it begin. I could feel the aching start, and as it got going, I knew nothing could be done. I would just have to suffer it. Then once Dad was home in the day, I felt one of these headaches come on. I started crying straight away, not because of the pain, but because of the pain that was on its way. Dad sat me down on the floor. He sat in a chair behind me. And he stroked my hair. Tugged at it, gently, ran it through his fingers, pressed down on my forehead and so gentle. And whispering something, I think. And kept on. Might have been 10 minutes. Might have been an hour. And eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the headache was gone. I swear it was a miracle. And those 2 days when I should have been in bed, crying and being sick. 0, it seemed like everything was perfect. Beat. He never did it again though. Jay, why not? Mrs. Reynolds, no reason. It just never happened that way. He was in the fields when the headaches came. Or he'd be busy and he'd have to stop. After a minute, my brothers would be around, clamoring for attention. Beat. Jay, I could stroke your hair for you. Mrs. Reynolds, would you? Jay, I won't be as good as your dad. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, I'd love that. Jay, right. Well. Mrs. Reynolds sits up slightly on the couch, so her head is resting on the couch's arm. Jay, okay. He fetches a chair, sits down behind her, and very gently begins to stroke her hair. Mrs. Reynolds, sorry if it's a bit greasy. Jay, it's fine. He tries rubbing her scalp. Mrs. Reynolds, oh, that's lovely. Jay, good. Mrs. Reynolds, I could just float off. Jay stops stroking her hair. Mrs. Reynolds, oh. Jay, there's just a couple of things more I want to ask you. Mrs. Reynolds, but it's so nice. Beat. Jay begins stroking her hair again. Mrs. Reynolds, don't feel you have to carry on. Jay, I don't. Mrs. Reynolds, I mean if your hands get tired. Jay, they won't. Mrs. Reynolds, they will in the end. Jay, I don't think so. You go to sleep now. If that's what you want. Jay keeps on stroking her hair. He stops. Stands. Looks at her. Jay, see, this is stupid. 'Cause I could do this. I could look after you. Mrs. Reynolds is still. Jay, I could though. Something changes in him. Jay, I could. He stands for a second. Then he rushes to her. Jay, no, 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 Mrs. R. Mrs. R, wake up. He gets out his phone, dials. Jay, on his phone. Yeah, hello. Yeah, I need an ambulance. Scene 10. The planter. A crisp day in early spring. Beautiful golden sunlight. Jay arrives with a bag and a few tools. Hanging around his neck is what looks like a mobile, but is actually a cheap, short-range walkie-talkie. Gets out a bin bag and starts picking up litter from the planter. Mel enters from the other side. Mel, all right. Jay, I'm great. Yourself? Mel, fine. Beat? Are you? Really? You look a bit tired. Jay, I am a bit. Mel, it's nice that you're still doing all this, looking after the planter. Jay, what was I just gonna stop? Anytime you feel like lending a hand, though. Mel, yeah, maybe I will. But Jay isn't paying attention, he's distracted by something from off. Jay, oh, will you ever learn? Mrs. Reynolds arrives. She's in an electric wheelchair, which she controls with a joystick. She has a walkie-talkie round her neck, just like Jay. Jay, I told you to buzz me if you wanted to come down. Mrs. Reynolds looks at him. Jay, and don't give me that look, one wrong move and you'll be off that thing and in the gutter. Mel shifts to be a bit more in Mrs. Reynolds' field of vision. Mel, higher, Mrs. R. Mrs. Reynolds looks at her. Mel doesn't know what to do. Waves, a bit limply. J to Mel. She's not big on conversation without her computer. But you can fill in her side, just by imagining the grumpiest possible thing a human being could say. To Mrs. Reynolds. Isn't that right? Mrs. Reynolds looks at him. J. Mrs. R, I'm shocked. To Mel. You don't often hear that sort of language from an old lady. Mel, anyway, I best be off. J. Oh, okay. Mel, nice to see you, Mrs. R. Mel leaves. J and Mrs. Reynolds watch her go. Then Jay looks to Mrs. Reynolds. Jay, I know. The thing is with Mel, is this time I'm playing the long game. I'm just gonna reel her in, you know, step by step. She won't even know it's happening. She'll just wake up one day and realize she can't live without me. Mrs. Reynolds shifts her chair slightly. Jay, do you want me to? Yeah. Jay maneuvers the wheelchair so it's next to the bench. Jay, look, you've got a bit of. He gets out a tissue and gently wipes saliva from the side of her mouth. He sits on the bench next to her. Jay, those cuttings I had off your roses. All taken. Every last one. And when me and Mel are back together. And we get ourselves a little house. In some dump up north. They will be the first things I plant. She lifts her hand from the joystick. He takes it. Jay, I know we're getting close to the end now. I know it's getting really hard. Just the sweet peas from the autumn are budding. They're going to flower tomorrow. The day after. Be great if you could stick around for those. Beat? But if you've had enough. If today's the day you want it to end. He can't say any more, just looks for her response. The tiniest shake of her head. Jay, no. No. You can manage another day. He watches her again. No motion this time, he sees the answer in her eyes. Jay, yeah. Me too. He sits back, a huge weight lifted. Jay, look at it. Will you look at it? What a morning. The end.